Prospero emerged from the ashes of old night as a world transformed by psychic awakening. Located in the galactic northwest, this distant planet had endured the same isolation and technological regression that plagued humanity during the Age of Strife, yet its people had discovered something extraordinary within themselves. Where other worlds fought with crude weapons and lost technologies, Prospero's inhabitants learned to harness the power of the warp through disciplined study and careful practice. The planet's surface bore little resemblance to the war-torn worlds that characterized much of human space during this dark age. Crystal spires rose from carefully planned cities, their surfaces refracting light in patterns that seemed to shift with the psychic emanations of their inhabitants. These weren't the haphazard constructions of desperate survivors, but the deliberate architecture of a civilization that had embraced its psychic potential rather than feared it. The crystal formations that gave the cities their distinctive appearance served both aesthetic and practical purposes, acting as conduits and amplifiers for psychic energy while creating structures of remarkable beauty. Tizca stood as the greatest of these crystal cities, its towering pyramids and interconnected spires reaching toward Prospero's pale sky. The city's layout followed geometric principles that enhanced psychic resonance, with broad avenues radiating from central nexus points where the planet's most powerful practitioners gathered to study and teach. Libraries filled with accumulated knowledge lined these thoroughfares, their contents representing centuries of careful documentation about the nature of psychic phenomena and the proper methods for its application. The inhabitants of Prospero had developed a unique approach to psychic development that set them apart from other human worlds. Rather than viewing their abilities as curses or divine gifts, they treated them as natural talents requiring education and discipline. Schools of psychic learning emerged throughout the crystal cities, each specializing in different aspects of mental power. Some focused on telepathic communication and mental shielding, while others explored the manipulation of matter through telekinetic force or the perception of future events through precognitive sight. This scholarly approach to psychic development created a culture where knowledge held supreme value. The people of Prospero became voracious collectors of information, sending expeditions to recover lost texts and artifacts from across their world and beyond. Their libraries grew to contain works on subjects ranging from theoretical physics to metaphysical philosophy, with particular emphasis on understanding the relationship between consciousness and reality. Scribes worked constantly to copy and preserve these texts, creating multiple versions to guard against loss, while also translating works from dead languages into contemporary Prosperine script. When Magnus the Red's gestation pod crashed onto Prospero's surface, the planet's psychic inhabitants immediately recognized the significance of his arrival. The infant Primarch's psychic presence blazed like a beacon to their enhanced senses, marking him as something far beyond their own considerable abilities. The scholars of Tizca gathered to study this extraordinary being, though their examination revealed little beyond the obvious fact that he represented a new order of psychic evolution. Magnus grew rapidly among Prospero's people, his towering frame and distinctive crimson skin marking him as clearly different from his adoptive world's inhabitants. His single eye, lost to circumstances that remained mysterious even to those closest to him, seemed to see far more than normal vision would allow. The young Primarch demonstrated an intuitive understanding of psychic principles that surpassed even Prospero's most accomplished practitioners, manipulating energies that had taken them lifetimes to master with casual ease. The Primarch's presence accelerated Prospero's development as a center of psychic learning. Magnus established new schools and research institutions, encouraging his adoptive people to push the boundaries of their understanding. Under his guidance, Prosperine scholars began exploring increasingly complex applications of psychic power, developing techniques for long-range communication, matter transmutation, and dimensional manipulation. These advances came with risks, as deeper exploration of psychic phenomena inevitably brought contact with the entities that dwelled within the warp, but Magnus taught methods for managing these dangers through careful preparation and protective rituals. When the Emperor arrived on Prospero to reclaim his lost son, he found a world that had achieved something remarkable. The meeting between father and son occurred within Tizca's greatest library, surrounded by accumulated knowledge that represented humanity's most advanced understanding of psychic phenomena outside of Terra itself. The Emperor recognized both the value of what Prospero had achieved and the potential dangers inherent in their approach to psychic study, though he chose to embrace the former while working to mitigate the latter. The reunion established Prospero's role within the emerging Imperium as a sanctuary for those blessed and cursed with psychic abilities. Magnus received command of the 15th Legion, the Thousand Sons, and began the process of recruiting from Prospero's population, while also drawing psychers from across the galaxy who sought refuge from persecution and proper training in their abilities. The planet became known throughout Imperial space as a place where those with psychic gifts could find acceptance and education rather than fear and execution. Prospero's recruitment practices differed significantly from those employed by other Space Marine legions. Rather than selecting candidates based purely on physical prowess and aggression, the Thousand Sons looked for individuals who demonstrated both psychic potential and intellectual capability. The planet's population provided an ideal recruiting ground, as generations of selective breeding and cultural emphasis on psychic development had produced unusually high numbers of latent psychers among the general populace. The Spire Guard, Prospero's mortal military forces, exemplified the integration of psychic abilities into the world's martial culture. These soldiers combined traditional weapons training with psychic enhancement techniques, using their mental powers to coordinate attacks, anticipate enemy movements, and protect themselves from hostile psychic influences. Spire Guard regiments organized around psychic specializations, with some units focusing on battlefield telepathy, while others emphasized precognitive tactics or telekinetic weapon guidance. Common citizens of Prospero incorporated psychic abilities into their daily lives in ways that would have seemed impossible or heretical on other Imperial worlds. Artisans used telekinetic precision to craft intricate crystal sculptures, while merchants employed limited telepathic abilities to better understand their customers' needs. Farmers enhanced their crops through careful application of psychic energy, and architects designed buildings that responded to the psychic emanations of their inhabitants. This integration of mental powers into mundane activities created a society where the distinction between normal and abnormal abilities became increasingly meaningless. The planet's educational system reflected this acceptance of psychic phenomena as natural aspects of human potential. Children received instruction in basic mental disciplines alongside traditional subjects, learning to control their emerging abilities through structured exercises and careful supervision. Those who showed particular promise received advanced training in specialized institutions, while others learned to apply their modest talents in support of their chosen professions. This systematic approach to psychic education produced a population that viewed mental powers as tools to be mastered rather than forces to be feared. Libraries throughout Prospero's crystal cities accumulated knowledge from across the galaxy as the Great Crusade progressed. Thousand Sons expeditionary fleets regularly sent back texts and artifacts recovered from conquered worlds, adding to collections that already contained pre-Age of Strife works on subjects that had been forgotten elsewhere in human space. These repositories became treasure troves of information about lost technologies, extinct civilizations, and theoretical frameworks for understanding reality itself. The planet's scholars developed increasingly sophisticated cataloging systems to manage their growing collections, creating cross-referenced indices that allowed researchers to locate relevant materials across multiple disciplines. Scribes worked in shifts to copy and preserve important texts, while translators labored to render works from dead languages into forms that contemporary readers could understand. Special vaults contain the most dangerous knowledge, texts that required careful handling and restricted access due to their potential for causing harm to unprepared readers. Prospero's role as a sanctuary for persecuted psychers drew individuals from across the galaxy who had fled worlds where their abilities marked them for death or imprisonment. These refugees brought with them diverse traditions and techniques, enriching the planet's psychic culture through the exchange of different approaches to mental development. Some arrived as individuals seeking personal safety, while others came in groups that had maintained their own distinct practices despite persecution elsewhere. The integration of these diverse psychic traditions created a cosmopolitan atmosphere within Prospero's cities. Former witch doctors from feral worlds shared knowledge with escaped astropaths from civilized planets, while self-taught hedge wizards learned alongside formally trained telepaths. This mixing of different psychic cultures accelerated the development of new techniques and theoretical frameworks, as practitioners combined elements from multiple traditions to create innovative approaches to mental power. Magnus personally oversaw many aspects of this cultural integration, using his vast psychic abilities to evaluate newcomers and determine how their skills might best contribute to Prospero's growing body of knowledge. The Primarch established protocols for safely testing unfamiliar psychic techniques, recognizing that practices developed in isolation might carry hidden dangers when applied without proper understanding of their underlying principles. The Thousand Sons Legion drew heavily from this diverse population of psychic refugees, finding among them individuals whose unique backgrounds and experiences made them valuable additions to the Legion's ranks. Former outcasts became Space Marines, their enhanced physiology combining with their psychic abilities to create warriors of extraordinary capability. These recruits brought with them knowledge of different worlds and cultures, providing the Legion with insights that proved valuable during the Great Crusade's expansion into previously unknown regions of space. The first manifestations of the flesh change appeared during the early years of the Great Crusade, striking without warning among the ranks of the 15th Legion. What began as isolated incidents among individual Space Marines quickly revealed itself as something far more sinister than battlefield injuries or standard genetic rejection of the Astartes implants. The curse manifested as uncontrolled mutations that twisted the enhanced physiology of the Thousand Sons into grotesque parodies of their former selves, transforming proud warriors into writhing masses of altered flesh and bone. The initial symptoms often appeared subtle, beginning with minor physical changes that could easily be dismissed as natural variation among the Legion's recruits. A Space Marine might notice his skin taking on an unusual texture, developing patches of scales or chitinous growths that seemed to shift and change when not directly observed. Others experienced alterations in bone structure, with limbs elongating or joints developing additional articulation points that allowed for impossible angles of movement. These early signs typically emerged during periods of intense psychic activity, suggesting a connection between the mutations and the Legion's extensive use of warp-derived powers. As the curse progressed, the transformations became increasingly severe and impossible to ignore. Affected Marines developed additional appendages that served no apparent purpose, sprouting from their torsos or backs in configurations that defied biological logic. Some victims grew clusters of eyes across their bodies, each organ capable of independent movement and possessed of an alien intelligence that seemed to observe things beyond normal perception. Others found their internal organs restructuring themselves, developing new cavities and chambers that pulsed with energies drawn from the warp itself. The most horrific cases involved complete dissolution of the victim's physical form, as their enhanced metabolism accelerated beyond all control and began consuming their own tissue. These unfortunate Marines would literally melt before their battle brothers' eyes, their flesh flowing like liquid, while somehow maintaining consciousness throughout the transformation. The resulting masses of protoplasmic matter retained fragments of their original personalities and memories, creating beings that could speak and think, but existed as formless puddles of living tissue that constantly shifted between different configurations. Magnus witnessed these transformations with growing horror and desperation, recognizing that the curse threatened not merely individual Marines, but the entire future of his Legion. The Crimson King threw himself into research with an intensity that bordered on obsession, seeking answers within the vast libraries of Prospero and the accumulated knowledge of the galaxy's psychic traditions. He consulted ancient texts recovered from dead civilizations, interviewed the oldest psychers among his adoptive world's population, and conducted experiments that pushed the boundaries of what even his superhuman intellect could comprehend. The Primarch's investigations revealed disturbing connections between the flesh change and the fundamental nature of the Thousand Sons' psychic abilities. Unlike other legions that possessed scattered psychers among their ranks, the 15th Legion drew almost exclusively from populations with strong psychic potential, creating a concentration of warp-sensitive individuals that had no precedent in Imperial history. This concentration appeared to create resonance effects that amplified both the beneficial aspects of psychic power and its inherent dangers, turning the Legion's greatest strength into a source of corruption. Magnus discovered that the curse struck most frequently among those Marines who demonstrated the strongest psychic abilities, suggesting that raw power without proper control created vulnerabilities that hostile warp entities could exploit. The transformations often began during moments of intense psychic exertion, when a Marine's mental defenses were focused outward rather than inward. This pattern indicated that the mutations represented not random genetic instability, but deliberate corruption by intelligences that existed within the immaterium and sought to claim the souls of those who ventured too deeply into their realm. The Primarch's research led him to explore increasingly dangerous sources of knowledge in his desperate search for a cure. He delved into texts that other Imperial scholars would have classified as forbidden, studying accounts of similar phenomena from civilizations that had vanished millennia before humanity's rise to galactic prominence. These ancient records spoke of races that had mastered psychic abilities beyond anything achieved by contemporary human psychers, only to fall victim to the same corrupting influences that now threatened the Thousand Sons. Magnus began conducting experiments that required him to venture directly into the warp, using his extraordinary psychic abilities to observe the curse's effects from within the immaterium itself. These journeys revealed the presence of entities that seemed to take particular interest in the Thousand Sons, beings of immense power and alien intelligence that regarded the Legion's psychic potential as both a threat and an opportunity. The Primarch learned to recognize the subtle influences these creatures exerted on reality, understanding how they manipulated the fundamental forces that governed mutation and change. The psychological impact of the flesh change extended far beyond its physical manifestations, creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that pervaded the entire Legion. Marines who had never shown symptoms watched their battle brothers with growing suspicion, wondering if they too carried the seeds of transformation within their enhanced physiology. The close bonds that typically characterized Space Marine brotherhoods began to fray as warriors isolated themselves rather than risk exposing others to potential contagion. Those Marines who survived the curse's early stages often found themselves changed in ways that went beyond mere physical alteration. Many reported experiencing visions and sensations that seemed to originate from outside their own consciousness, as if their transformed bodies had become conduits for alien thoughts and emotions. These individuals struggled to maintain their sense of identity while adapting to forms that no longer resembled their original human appearance, creating internal conflicts that sometimes proved more destructive than the mutations themselves. The Legion's command structure adapted to accommodate the reality of the curse, implementing protocols for identifying and containing affected Marines before their transformations could spread or cause harm to their brothers. Apothecaries developed techniques for monitoring early symptoms, though their efforts proved largely futile as the curse seemed to follow no consistent pattern in its manifestations. Some Marines transformed within hours of showing initial signs, while others remained stable for months before succumbing to sudden and catastrophic mutation. Magnus established quarantine facilities on Prospero, where affected Marines could be isolated and studied, hoping to learn more about the curse's progression while preventing its spread to healthy members of the Legion. These installations became laboratories where the Primarch and his most trusted advisors conducted experiments that would have horrified other Imperial authorities, dissecting transformed Marines and attempting to reverse their mutations through a combination of surgical intervention and psychic manipulation. The failure of these early treatment attempts forced Magnus to consider increasingly desperate measures, including the use of sorcerous techniques that drew directly from the warp's chaotic energies. The Primarch began studying practices that the Emperor had explicitly warned against, justifying his actions as necessary sacrifices to save his remaining sons. These forbidden arts required Magnus to make contact with the same entities that seemed to be causing the curse, creating a paradox where the potential cure might prove more dangerous than the disease itself. As the curse continued to claim victims, the Thousand Sons Legion shrank from its original strength of over 100,000 Space Marines to a fraction of that number. Entire companies vanished as their members succumbed to transformation or were deemed too dangerous to remain with the Legion. The survivors found themselves increasingly isolated within the broader Imperial military structure, as other legions began to view them with suspicion and fear. Magnus's growing obsession with finding a cure led him to spend increasing amounts of time in isolation, conducting research and experiments that he shared with no one else. The Primarch's behavior became increasingly erratic as he delved deeper into forbidden knowledge, displaying mood swings and periods of distraction that concerned even his closest advisors. His physical appearance began to change as well, with his remaining eye taking on an otherworldly gleam, and his psychic aura becoming so intense that unprotected mortals could not remain in his presence for extended periods. The Primarch's research eventually led him to make contact with entities that claimed to possess the knowledge necessary to halt the flesh change, beings that presented themselves as teachers rather than the predators they truly were. These creatures offered Magnus bargains and exchanges, promising cures in return for services that seemed minor at the time, but carried implications that the desperate Primarch failed to fully consider. Each transaction brought temporary relief for some affected Marines while drawing Magnus deeper into a web of obligations and debts that would eventually consume both him and his legion. The surviving Thousand Sons adapted to their reduced numbers by reorganizing into smaller, more specialized units that could maximize the effectiveness of their remaining psychic abilities. These formations became highly elite forces capable of achievements that far exceeded their numerical strength, but their success came at the cost of becoming increasingly dependent on the very powers that threatened to destroy them. The Legion's culture evolved to embrace risk-taking and experimentation as necessary elements of survival, creating an environment where dangerous practices became normalized through necessity. Magnus's desperate search for a solution to the flesh change led him down paths that even his vast intellect struggled to comprehend fully. The Primarch's research had revealed that the curse originated from forces beyond the material realm, entities that dwelled within the warp and fed upon the psychic energies that his legion wielded with such skill. Traditional medicine and genetic manipulation proved useless against transformations that operated according to laws that had nothing to do with biological science, forcing Magnus to seek answers from sources that the Emperor had explicitly forbidden. The breakthrough came during one of Magnus's deepest forays into the Immaterium, a psychic journey that took him far beyond the relatively safe regions of the warp that human psychers typically explored. In this alien realm where thought became reality and emotions took physical form, the Primarch encountered an entity of immense power and ancient cunning. This being presented itself not as the predatory demon that it truly was, but as a teacher and scholar who shared Magnus's passion for knowledge and understanding. The creature called itself the Changer of Ways, though it possessed countless other names and titles accumulated across eons of existence. Tzinch, for this was the true identity of the entity that Magnus had contacted, recognized the Primarch's desperation, and exploited it with the subtle manipulation that characterized all of the Chaos God's dealings with mortals. The demon god did not present itself as an enemy or corruptor, but rather as a fellow seeker of knowledge who had observed the Thousand Sons' plight with interest and sympathy. It spoke of the flesh change as a crude manifestation of forces that could be controlled and directed by those who possessed sufficient understanding, offering to share the secrets necessary to halt the curses spread among Magnus's remaining sons. The bargain that Tzeentch proposed seemed almost reasonable to the desperate Primarch. In exchange for knowledge that would stabilize the genetic structure of the Thousand Sons and prevent further mutations, Magnus would sacrifice his remaining eye and pledge the souls of his legion to the Chaos God's service. The entity presented these terms as temporary measures, claiming that the Primarch's eye would be returned once he had mastered the techniques necessary to cure his sons permanently, and that the soul binding would dissolve once the immediate crisis had passed. Magnus, consumed by his need to save his legion and blinded by his own intellectual pride, accepted the bargain without fully understanding its implications. The Primarch believed that his superior knowledge and psychic abilities would allow him to manipulate the agreement to his advantage, using Tzeentch's power while avoiding the entity's ultimate control. This fatal miscalculation demonstrated how even the most brilliant minds could be deceived when desperation clouded their judgment and ego convinced them of their own invincibility. The immediate effects of the pact seemed to validate Magnus's decision. The flesh change ceased its relentless spread through the Legion's ranks, with affected Marines stabilizing in their current forms rather than continuing to mutate beyond recognition. Those who had already undergone partial transformation found their conditions becoming manageable, allowing them to function as warriors despite their altered appearances. New recruits no longer faced the immediate threat of corruption that had claimed so many of their predecessors, enabling the Legion to begin rebuilding its depleted numbers. However, the true cost of Magnus's bargain extended far beyond the obvious sacrifice of his eye and the theoretical binding of his Legion's souls. Tzeentch's influence began to permeate every aspect of the Thousand Sons' culture and practices, subtly altering their approach to psychic development and their understanding of the forces they wielded. The Chaos God's corruption worked through seemingly beneficial improvements to their abilities, making the changes appear as natural evolution rather than external manipulation. Ozek Ahriman emerged as one of the most significant figures in implementing the new psychic disciplines that arose from Magnus's pact with Tzeentch. The chief librarian possessed both the intellectual capacity to understand the complex theories underlying the enhanced techniques and the practical experience necessary to train other Marines in their application. Ahriman's own psychic abilities had grown substantially following the bargain, allowing him to perceive patterns and possibilities that had previously remained hidden from even his enhanced perception. Under Ahriman's guidance, the Thousand Sons developed increasingly sophisticated methods for channeling and controlling warp energy. These techniques went far beyond the relatively simple applications that other Imperial Psykers employed, incorporating complex ritual elements and theoretical frameworks that drew directly from knowledge provided by Tzeentch. The practices appeared to offer greater precision and power than traditional psychic disciplines, making them attractive to Marines who sought to maximize their effectiveness in battle. The chief librarian established formal training programs that codified these new techniques into teachable forms, creating curricula that could be passed down to future generations of Thousand Sons. These educational systems incorporated elements from various psychic traditions that Ahriman had studied, combining human knowledge with insights that originated from sources within the warp itself. The resulting synthesis produced methods that seemed to represent the pinnacle of psychic achievement, though their true origins remained hidden from most practitioners. Ahriman's work attracted the attention of other accomplished sorcerers within the Legion, individuals who possessed both the ability to master the new techniques and the authority to implement them among their subordinates. These figures formed an informal council of advisors who worked closely with the chief librarian to refine and improve the psychic disciplines, creating a collaborative environment that encouraged experimentation and innovation. Their efforts produced rapid advances in the Legion's capabilities, though each breakthrough brought them deeper under Tzeentch's influence. The establishment of the Rahadi cult fellowships represented a formalization of the psychic hierarchies that had emerged within the Thousand Sons following Magnus's bargain. These organizations provided structure for the Legion's increasingly complex approach to psychic development, creating specialized groups that focused on particular aspects of warp manipulation. Each fellowship developed its own traditions and practices, though all shared the common goal of advancing their members' understanding and control of psychic forces. The Rahati fellowships organized around specific psychic disciplines rather than traditional military hierarchies, creating a system where advancement depended on demonstrated mastery of particular techniques rather than simple seniority or combat achievement. This approach attracted Marines who showed exceptional talent in specific areas, allowing them to receive specialized training that maximized their potential contributions to the Legion's overall capabilities. The fellowships became centers of learning and experimentation, where new techniques could be developed and tested under controlled conditions. Each cult fellowship developed its own distinctive culture and practices, reflecting the personalities and interests of their founding members. Some groups focused on combat applications of psychic power, developing techniques for enhancing weapons and armor through warp energy, or creating protective barriers that could deflect enemy attacks. Others concentrated on information gathering and analysis, using their abilities to perceive hidden truths and predict future events with unprecedented accuracy. The Corvidi Fellowship specialized in divination and precognitive techniques, training their members to perceive the branching paths of possibility that extended from any given moment. These Marines learned to read the subtle signs that indicated which futures were most likely to manifest, providing their brothers with tactical advantages that proved invaluable during complex military operations. Their abilities allowed the Thousand Sons to anticipate enemy movements and adapt their strategies accordingly, making them far more effective than their numbers alone would suggest. The Pavoni Fellowship focused on biomancy and the manipulation of living tissue, developing techniques that could heal wounds, enhance physical capabilities, or even reshape flesh according to the practitioner's will. These abilities proved particularly valuable given the Legion's history with the flesh change, as Pavoni sorcerers could stabilize mutations and prevent harmful transformations from progressing beyond manageable limits. Their work complemented the broader effects of Magnus's bargain, providing individual-level interventions that maintained the Legion's fighting effectiveness. The Piri Fellowship concentrated on pyromancy and the destructive applications of psychic power, training their members to channel warp energy into devastating attacks that could incinerate enemies or melt through the strongest armor. These Marines became specialists in assault operations, using their abilities to break through defensive positions and eliminate high-value targets with surgical precision. Their techniques incorporated elements of both traditional pyrokinesis and more exotic forms of energy manipulation that drew directly from the Immaterium's chaotic forces. The Raptora Fellowship developed expertise in telekinesis and force manipulation, creating techniques that could move objects across vast distances or generate protective barriers of solidified psychic energy. These abilities proved invaluable in both offensive and defensive operations, allowing Raptora sorcerers to reposition equipment and personnel while simultaneously protecting their allies from enemy fire. Their mastery of kinetic forces made them particularly effective in void combat, where traditional weapons often proved inadequate. The Athenians specialized in telepathy and mental manipulation, training their members to read thoughts, implant suggestions, and communicate across impossible distances without technological assistance. These Marines became the Legion's primary intelligence gatherers, using their abilities to extract information from captured enemies and coordinate complex operations through direct mind-to-mind contact. Their techniques proved particularly effective against opponents who lacked psychic defenses, allowing the Thousand Sons to achieve victories through psychological warfare rather than brute force. The formalization of psychic ranks within these fellowships created a hierarchy based on demonstrated mastery of specific techniques rather than traditional military seniority. Neophytes began their training with basic exercises designed to develop fundamental control over their abilities, gradually advancing through increasingly complex disciplines as their skills improved. Those who showed exceptional talent or dedication could achieve the rank of adept, gaining access to advanced techniques and the authority to train other Marines in their specializations. The highest rank within each fellowship was that of Magister, a position reserved for those who had achieved complete mastery of their chosen discipline and contributed significantly to its development. Magisters served as both teachers and researchers, working to expand the boundaries of what their fellowships could achieve while ensuring that knowledge was preserved and transmitted to future generations. These individuals often possessed abilities that bordered on the miraculous, demonstrating levels of psychic control that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Tzeentch's growing influence over the Legion manifested in subtle changes to their psychic practices and philosophical outlook that initially appeared beneficial rather than corrupting. The techniques taught within the Rahadi fellowships incorporated ritual elements that seemed to enhance their effectiveness, though these ceremonies actually served to strengthen the bonds between the practitioners and their patron deity. Marines who regularly employed these methods found their abilities growing stronger over time, creating a positive feedback loop that encouraged continued use despite the hidden costs. The philosophical changes that accompanied these practical improvements proved even more significant in the long term. The Thousand Sons began to view knowledge and power as ends in themselves, rather than tools for serving the Emperor's vision of human unity. This shift reflected Tzeentch's fundamental nature as a deity of change and ambition, gradually altering the Legion's priorities and values in ways that aligned with the Chaos God's ultimate objectives. The pursuit of forbidden knowledge became increasingly normalized within the Legion's culture, as Marines justified their research as necessary for protecting humanity from threats that conventional Imperial doctrine could not address. This rationalization allowed them to explore increasingly dangerous subjects while maintaining their self-image as loyal servants of the Emperor, creating cognitive dissonance that Tzeentch exploited to deepen their corruption. The Emperor's growing unease with the proliferation of psychic powers within the Space Marine legions had been building for decades, as reports filtered back from the Great Crusade's expanding fronts. What had initially appeared as isolated incidents of warp-related catastrophes began forming a disturbing pattern that threatened the very foundation of his grand design for humanity's future. Entire expeditionary fleets had vanished without trace after their librarians attempted ambitious psychic reconnaissance missions, while other forces reported encounters with entities that seemed drawn to concentrations of psychers, like predators following the scent of blood. The most troubling reports came from legions that had embraced psychic warfare as a primary tactical doctrine. The Space Wolves had encountered phenomena during the Burning of Prospero that their own rune priests struggled to explain, while the White Scars reported that their Stormseers occasionally received visions that led entire brotherhoods into carefully prepared ambushes. Even the supposedly disciplined librarians of the Ultramarines had begun experiencing prophetic dreams that proved disturbingly accurate, raising questions about the source of their enhanced abilities and the price of their continued use. The Emperor's own observations during his travels across the galaxy had revealed the true scope of the threat that uncontrolled psychic development posed to humanity's survival. Ancient Xenos ruins bore evidence of civilizations that had achieved remarkable psychic mastery only to vanish completely, leaving behind only twisted architecture and energy signatures that resonated with the same frequencies generated by human psychers. These archaeological discoveries suggested that the path the Space Marine legions were following had been traveled before by other species, with universally catastrophic results. Terra's own psychic institutions provided additional cause for concern as the Adeptus Astra Telepathica struggled to maintain control over the increasing numbers of psychers being discovered throughout Imperial space. The Black Ships returned from their collection runs with holds full of individuals whose abilities far exceeded anything recorded in previous generations, while the selection processes for creating astropaths and sanctioned psychers began failing at unprecedented rates. The Emperor recognized these developments as symptoms of humanity's accelerating psychic evolution, a transformation that could either elevate the species to unprecedented heights or destroy it entirely. The decision to convene the Council of Nikaea represented the emperor's attempt to address these growing concerns through reasoned debate rather than imperial decree. He selected the world of Nikaea for its symbolic significance as a place where ancient scholars had once gathered to establish fundamental principles of knowledge and truth. The planet's carefully maintained amphitheaters and libraries provided an appropriate setting for discussions that would determine the future of psychic development within the Imperium, while its isolation from major trade routes ensured that the proceedings would remain confidential. The formal summons to attend the council went out to all 18 Primarchs, though the Emperor made it clear that the focus would be on those legions that had made extensive use of psychic abilities during their campaigns. Representatives from the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Imperial Army, and various other imperial institutions received invitations to observe and provide testimony, creating a gathering that represented the full spectrum of opinion within the Imperium's leadership structure. Magnus the Red arrived on Nikaea with a carefully prepared presentation that he believed would demonstrate the invaluable contributions psychic abilities made to the Great Crusade's success. The Crimson King brought with him detailed records of battles where Thousand Sons librarians had provided decisive advantages, along with theoretical frameworks that explained how properly trained psychers could serve as humanity's ultimate defense against the threats lurking within the warp. His confidence in the righteousness of his position was absolute, as he genuinely believed that any rational examination of the evidence would vindicate his legion's practices. Mortarian's arrival created an immediate atmosphere of tension, as the Death Lord made no attempt to conceal his disgust for the psychic arts and those who practiced them. The Primarch of the 14th Legion had witnessed firsthand the devastation that uncontrolled psychic phenomena could wreak, having grown up on a world where witch kings used warp-derived powers to terrorize and oppress the human population. His experiences had convinced him that all psychic abilities were inherently corrupting, regardless of the practitioner's intentions or the safeguards they employed. The Death Lord's testimony before the assembled council drew upon his personal history to illustrate the dangers of allowing psychic powers to flourish unchecked. Mortarian described the horrific experiments conducted by Barbaros's overlords, beings that had once been human, but had transformed themselves into monsters through their pursuit of forbidden knowledge. He argued that the Space Marine librarians represented the first step down the same path that had led to his homeworld's corruption, warning that their continued existence would inevitably result in similar catastrophes throughout Imperial space. Jagatai Khan's position proved more nuanced than either Magnus or Mortarian's extreme stances, reflecting the White Scar's pragmatic approach to psychic phenomena. The Khan acknowledged the potential dangers that uncontrolled psychic development posed, while simultaneously recognizing the tactical advantages that properly trained psychers provided to military operations. His testimony focused on the need for strict discipline and oversight rather than complete prohibition, arguing that the solution lay in better training and more rigorous selection processes rather than wholesale abandonment of psychic capabilities. The Khan's Stormseers had developed techniques that seemed to minimize the risks associated with psychic practice through careful attention to traditional shamanic practices and natural limitations. These methods emphasized harmony with natural forces rather than the aggressive manipulation of warp energies that characterized other legions' approaches, creating a system that had produced fewer catastrophic failures while still providing significant battlefield advantages. Jagatai presented this approach as a potential middle ground that could satisfy both sides of the debate. Leman Russ's testimony created considerable controversy, as the Wolf King attempted to distinguish between his legion's rune priests and the librarians employed by other forces. The Space Wolves Primarch argued that his warriors drew their power from Fenris itself rather than the warp, claiming that this fundamental difference made their abilities safer and more reliable than traditional psychic techniques. This position drew immediate challenges from Magnus, who pointed out that all psychic phenomena ultimately derived from the same source regardless of the cultural framework used to understand them. The debate between Russ and Magnus became increasingly heated as the two Primarchs clashed over fundamental questions about the nature of psychic power and its relationship to the warp. The Wolf King's insistence that his rune priests were somehow different from other psychers struck Magnus as willful ignorance, while Russ viewed the Crimson King's detailed explanations as dangerous intellectualization of forces that should be approached with caution and respect rather than academic analysis. Lorger's contribution to the proceedings reflected the word-bearers' complex relationship with psychic phenomena and their growing interest in spiritual matters that transcended traditional imperial doctrine. The Primarch of the 17th Legion spoke about the need to understand the deeper meanings behind psychic abilities, arguing that they represented humanity's connection to forces that existed beyond the material universe. His testimony suggested that proper spiritual preparation could provide protection against the corrupting influences that others had described, though he remained vague about the specific practices he had in mind. The War Master Horus's position carried particular weight given his status as the Emperor's chosen representative and his extensive experience commanding forces that included multiple legions with significant psychic capabilities. Horus spoke about the practical necessities of the Great Crusade and the tactical advantages that librarians provided in battles against Xeno's forces that employed their own psychic abilities. He argued that unilateral disarmament would leave Imperial forces vulnerable to enemies who felt no similar constraints, creating strategic disadvantages that could prove fatal during critical engagements. Fulgrim's testimony focused on the aesthetic and intellectual aspects of psychic development, presenting the abilities as another form of perfection that humanity could achieve through dedicated practice and study. The Phoenix's perspective emphasized the individual benefits that psychic training provided, including enhanced perception, improved decision-making capabilities, and access to knowledge that remained hidden from normal human consciousness. He argued that prohibiting such development would represent a deliberate limitation on human potential that contradicted the Emperor's vision of species advancement. Rogel Dorn's contribution reflected the Imperial Fist's methodical approach to military problems and their emphasis on practical solutions over theoretical debates. The Praetorian acknowledged both the benefits and risks associated with psychic abilities, while focusing on the question of how best to manage these forces within existing imperial structures. His testimony emphasized the need for clear regulations and oversight mechanisms that could prevent abuses while preserving legitimate military applications. Sanguinius spoke with the authority of one whose own abilities had proven invaluable during numerous campaigns, though the angel's testimony revealed his deep concerns about the psychological toll that psychic development could exact on practitioners. The Blood Angel's Primarch described incidents where his legion's librarians had suffered mental breakdowns after exposure to particularly intense warp phenomena, warning that the human mind might not be capable of safely processing the energies that advanced psychic techniques required. The formal presentations continued for days as each faction presented their arguments and supporting evidence to the assembled council. Representatives from various imperial institutions provided additional testimony about their experiences with psychers, creating a comprehensive picture of both the benefits and dangers associated with psychic development. The debates often became heated as fundamental disagreements about the nature of reality and humanity's place within it came to the surface. Magnus's final presentation represented the culmination of years of research and preparation, as he attempted to demonstrate the full potential of properly controlled psychic abilities. The Crimson King used his own powers to create elaborate illusions that showed the assembled delegates visions of possible futures where humanity had mastered the forces of the warp and used them to achieve unprecedented prosperity and security. These demonstrations were intended to show that the risks associated with psychic development could be managed through proper education and training. However, Magnus's display had the opposite effect from what he intended, as many observers found the raw power he wielded deeply disturbing rather than reassuring. The ease with which the Crimson King manipulated reality itself served to highlight the potential for abuse that such abilities represented, while his obvious pride in his accomplishments suggested a dangerous level of hubris that could lead to catastrophic mistakes. The very impressiveness of his demonstration became evidence for his opponent's arguments about the corrupting nature of psychic power. The Emperor's final judgment reflected his assessment of all the testimony and evidence presented during the Council's proceedings, though his decision also incorporated knowledge and concerns that he did not share with the assembled delegates. The Master of Mankind had observed the growing influence of chaos entities throughout the galaxy and recognized that humanity's psychic awakening was attracting the attention of forces that viewed the species as either a threat to be eliminated or a resource to be exploited. The Edict of Nikaea formally disbanded all librarious departments within the Space Marine Legions and prohibited the use of psychic abilities for military purposes, though it included exceptions for essential functions such as astropathic communication and navigator guidance. The decree established strict penalties for violations, while providing mechanisms for those with psychic abilities to serve the Imperium in approved capacities through existing institutions like the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. Magnus's reaction to the Emperor's decision revealed the depth of his shock and disappointment as he struggled to understand how his father could reject abilities that had proven so valuable during the Great Crusade. The Crimson King's acceptance of the edict was grudging and bitter, though he publicly pledged his legion's compliance with the new regulations. His private thoughts dwelt on the injustice of the decision and the short-sightedness that he believed it represented, setting the stage for the tragic events that would follow. The immediate aftermath of the Council saw the various legions beginning the process of implementing the Emperor's edict according to their own interpretations of its requirements. Some forces disbanded their librarious departments completely and reassigned their psychers to non-combat roles, while others found ways to maintain their psychic capabilities through creative reinterpretations of the regulations. The varying approaches to compliance created inconsistencies that would later prove significant as the galaxy moved toward the catastrophic events of the Horus Heresy. The seeds of the galaxy's greatest catastrophe were sown on the moon of Davin, where Horus Lupercal lay dying from wounds that defied all conventional treatment. The Warmaster's injuries, inflicted by the demon-possessed blade of Yugen Temba, carried a corruption that ate at his superhuman physiology like acid through ceramite. The Luna Wolves apothecaries worked frantically to stabilize their gene father, but the toxins coursing through his system originated from sources that mortal medicine could not comprehend, let alone counter. As Horus's condition deteriorated, his breathing became labored, and his skin took on a sickly pallor that alarmed even the most experienced medical personnel. Erebus of the Word-Bearers observed the crisis with carefully concealed satisfaction, recognizing the opportunity that the Warmaster's condition presented for advancing his own dark agenda. The first chaplain had spent decades preparing for this moment, cultivating relationships within the Luna Wolves' command structure, while simultaneously studying the ancient practices of Davin's warrior lodges. His knowledge of the moon's primitive but potent spiritual traditions provided him with the tools necessary to exploit Horus's desperate situation, though he presented his suggestions as acts of loyal service rather than manipulation. The decision to seek healing from Davin's indigenous shamans represented a fundamental departure from Imperial doctrine, though the Luna Wolves' desperation made them receptive to options they would normally have rejected. Erebus presented the local priests as practitioners of ancient healing arts that predated the Imperium's arrival, emphasizing their success in treating conditions that Imperial medicine had failed to address. The Word-Bearers' arguments gained credibility from the visible failure of conventional treatments and the growing certainty that their Primarch would die without immediate intervention. The Serpent Lodge's rituals took place within chambers carved from Davin's bedrock, spaces that resonated with energies accumulated over millennia of spiritual practice. The shamans who conducted the ceremony wore elaborate masks and robes, decorated with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering torchlight, creating an atmosphere of otherworldly power that impressed even the skeptical Astartes who accompanied their stricken leader. The air itself felt thick with potential, as if reality had become malleable within the confines of the ritual space. Horus's consciousness descended into the warp during the healing ceremony, though he experienced this journey as a series of visions that seemed to reveal hidden truths about the Emperor's plans for humanity. The entities that guided him through this experience presented themselves as loyal servants who sought to protect the War Master from deceptions that had been practiced upon him since his discovery on Thonia. These beings showed Horus images of a future where the Emperor abandoned his sons after achieving godhood, leaving them to rule over a sterile empire that had been stripped of all meaning and purpose. The visions revealed the Emperor's secret project on Terra, depicting the construction of a vast webway gate that would eliminate humanity's dependence on warp travel, and the navigators who guided Imperial vessels through the immaterium. Horus saw his father laboring in hidden chambers beneath the Imperial Palace, surrounded by arcane machinery and forbidden knowledge that he had kept secret from even his most trusted sons. The images suggested that the Emperor viewed the Primarchs as temporary tools to be discarded once their usefulness had ended, replaceable generals whose loyalty would become inconvenient once the Great Crusade reached its conclusion. The corruption that took hold of Horus during his time within the warp operated through subtle alterations to his personality and priorities, rather than the obvious physical mutations that characterized other forms of chaos influence. The War Master emerged from the healing ritual, apparently restored to full health. His wounds healed and his strength returned, but the experience had fundamentally altered his relationship with duty and loyalty. Where he had once served the Emperor out of genuine devotion and shared purpose, he now acted from a growing sense of betrayal and resentment that colored every aspect of his decision-making. The change in Horus became apparent through small shifts in behavior that initially seemed like natural responses to the stress of commanding the Great Crusade. The War Master began questioning orders from Terra more frequently, expressing doubts about strategic decisions that he would previously have implemented without hesitation. His interactions with other Primarchs became more calculating as he evaluated their potential usefulness for his own emerging agenda, while his treatment of mortal commanders grew increasingly dismissive and authoritarian. Erebus carefully nurtured these changes through seemingly casual conversations and strategic briefings that reinforced Horus's growing paranoia about the Emperor's true intentions. The Word-Bearer presented himself as a loyal advisor who shared the War Master's concerns about the direction of Imperial policy, offering analysis and interpretation that supported Horus's darkest suspicions. These discussions took place during private moments when the War Master's mental defenses were lowered, allowing the corruption to take deeper root with each exchange. The warrior lodges that had existed within several legions, as informal fraternal organizations, became vehicles for spreading Horus's growing disillusionment throughout the Astartes ranks. These gatherings had traditionally provided opportunities for space marines from different companies and chapters to share experiences and build bonds that transcended formal military hierarchies, but they now served as forums where carefully crafted doubts about Imperial leadership could be introduced and discussed. The lodge meetings created an atmosphere of shared conspiracy that made participants feel like they possessed special knowledge about the true state of the galaxy. Horus's recruitment of other Primarchs to his cause required careful assessment of each brother's psychological vulnerabilities and personal grievances against the Emperor or the Imperium's current direction. The War Master understood that direct confrontation would fail against beings of such power and conviction, so he instead worked to amplify existing doubts and resentments until they reached a tipping point where rebellion became inevitable. Each Primarch required a different approach based on their individual personalities and the specific circumstances that had shaped their development. Fulgrim's corruption began during his discovery of a lair sword on the world of Laren, though Horus played a crucial role in encouraging the Phoenix to embrace the weapon despite the obvious dangers it represented. The War Master praised Fulgrim's pursuit of perfection, while subtly suggesting that the Emperor's vision for humanity was too limiting to accommodate truly superior beings. These conversations planted seeds of doubt about whether the Imperium's rigid structures could provide adequate scope for the achievements that the Primarchs were capable of reaching. Angron's recruitment proved relatively straightforward, given the World Eater's Primarch's existing resentment toward the Emperor for preventing him from dying alongside his gladiator brothers on New Syria. Horus presented rebellion as an opportunity for Angron to finally achieve the glorious death in battle that had been denied to him, while also offering the chance to inflict suffering on the father who had robbed him of his chosen fate. The War Master understood that Angron's psychological damage made him unsuitable for complex strategic planning, but his raw fury would prove invaluable during the violent confrontations that lay ahead. Mortarian's conversion required appeals to his deep-seated hatred of tyrants and his belief that the Emperor represented another form of the oppressive overlords he had fought on Barbarous. Horus argued that their father's psychic abilities and secretive behavior marked him as fundamentally similar to the Witch Kings that had terrorized Mortarian's homeworld, suggesting that the Imperium was simply a larger version of the same oppressive system. The Death Lord's own experiences with corruption and his intimate knowledge of how power could twist even well-intentioned leaders made him receptive to these arguments. The planning for Istvan III required months of careful preparation as Horus worked to identify loyalist elements within the traitor legions and develop methods for eliminating them without revealing his own treachery to Imperial authorities. The War Master recognized that many Space Marines would never willingly turn against the Emperor regardless of their Primarch's decisions, making it necessary to remove these potential threats before beginning open rebellion. The virus bombing of the planet's surface would provide an efficient solution to this problem, while also serving as a declaration of intent that would force other legions to choose sides. The selection of targets for the Istvan III deployment involved detailed analysis of personnel records and psychological profiles as Horus and his conspirators identified Marines whose loyalty to the Emperor outweighed their devotion to their Primarchs. These individuals represented the most dangerous opposition to the rebellion's success, as their intimate knowledge of Legion capabilities and tactics would make them formidable enemies if they survived to organize resistance. The deployment orders were crafted to place these loyalists in positions where they would bear the brunt of the virus attack while keeping potential converts safely aboard the fleet. Captain Garville Loken of the Luna Wolves found himself among the forces selected for the surface deployment, though he remained unaware of the true reasons behind his assignment. The veteran officer had begun expressing doubts about some of the War Master's recent decisions, questioning orders that seemed to contradict established Imperial doctrine and expressing concern about the influence of Word-Bearer's advisors within the Legion command structure. These concerns marked him as a potential threat to Horus's plans, making his elimination a necessary precondition for the rebellion's success. The World Eater's contingent selected for Istvan III included many of the Legion's most stable and disciplined warriors, Marines who had managed to resist the worst effects of the psycho-surgical implants that drove their brothers into mindless fury. These individuals represented the last remnants of the 12th Legion's pre-Angron character, making them unsuitable for the kind of warfare that the Primarch envisioned for his forces. Their removal would leave behind only the most savage and unstable elements, creating a force that existed purely for destruction rather than conquest. The Death Guard deployment included veterans who had served with distinction during the Legion's most challenging campaigns, warriors whose experience and tactical acumen made them natural leaders among their brothers. Mortarian's selection process focused on eliminating potential rallying points for resistance within the Legion, ensuring that those who remained would lack the organizational capability necessary to mount effective opposition to his authority. The Primarch's intimate knowledge of his son's capabilities allowed him to identify threats with deadly accuracy. Emperor's children forces assigned to the surface included Marines who had maintained their dedication to the original ideals of perfection that had once defined their legion, individuals who viewed Fulgrim's recent changes with growing alarm and suspicion. These loyalists represented a connection to the Legion's pre-corruption identity that could potentially serve as a foundation for resistance against the Primarch's new direction. Their elimination would remove the last obstacles to the complete transformation of the Third Legion into servants of excess and sensation. The virus bombing itself represented a new level of horror in warfare, as the Life Eater virus consumed every organic molecule on Istvan III's surface within hours of deployment. The weapon worked by breaking down biological matter at the cellular level, reducing complex organisms to their component chemicals in a process that generated tremendous heat and toxic gases. The Marines on the surface found their enhanced physiology providing no protection against an attack that operated below the level of biological resistance, though some managed to find temporary shelter in sealed bunkers and underground facilities. The firestorm that followed the initial virus attack consumed the atmosphere itself, as the gases produced by biological decomposition ignited in a planet-wide conflagration that lasted for days. The flames reached temperatures that melted rock and vaporized metal, creating a hellscape where survival seemed impossible even for beings as durable as Space Marines. The few loyalists who survived the initial attack found themselves trapped in an environment that challenged every aspect of their enhanced capabilities. Horus's revelation of his treachery to the surviving loyalists came through Vox transmissions that were broadcast across the planet's surface as the War Master explained his actions and offered final opportunities for submission. These communications revealed the depth of planning that had gone into the betrayal, while also demonstrating the complete transformation of a figure who had once been regarded as the most loyal of the Emperor's sons. The psychological impact of hearing their former commander's words proved almost as devastating as the physical destruction surrounding the survivors. The battle for survival on Istvan III's surface lasted for months as the remaining loyalists fought against increasingly desperate odds, while Horus deployed additional forces to complete their elimination. The traitor Marines sent to finish the job found themselves facing opponents who fought with the fury of the betrayed, warriors who had nothing left to lose, and every reason to make their deaths as costly as possible. The prolonged fighting served Horus's purposes by providing a testing ground for his forces, while also ensuring that no loyalist survivors could escape to warn the wider Imperium of his treachery. The corruption spreading through the traitor legions accelerated following the virus bombing, as the act of mass fratricide broke psychological barriers that had previously restrained the influence of chaos entities. Marines who had participated in the betrayal found themselves experiencing visions and sensations that originated from sources within the warp, while their equipment began manifesting subtle changes that reflected the growing influence of their patron deities. These transformations started slowly but gained momentum as the rebels embraced powers that promised victory over their former brothers. Magnus the Red perceived these changes through his enhanced psychic abilities long before conventional intelligence networks could detect the War Master's treachery. The Crimson King's consciousness regularly ventured into the immaterium during his meditative practices, exploring the currents of possibility and probability that flowed through the warp's chaotic depths. During one such journey, his awareness brushed against psychic emanations that carried the distinctive signature of his brother Horus, though the familiar mental pattern had become twisted by influences that Magnus recognized with growing horror as the touch of the ruinous powers. The initial contact came as fleeting impressions that might have been dismissed as random psychic interference, but Magnus's centuries of experience in navigating the warp's treacherous currents allowed him to distinguish between natural phenomena and deliberate corruption. The psychic resonance surrounding Horus pulsed with the same malevolent energies that Magnus had encountered during his deepest explorations of forbidden knowledge, signatures that belonged to entities whose very existence represented an existential threat to humanity's survival. The realization that his brother had fallen under such influence filled the Crimson King with a dread that transcended personal concern and touched upon the fate of the entire species. Magnus expanded his psychic surveillance despite the explicit prohibitions of the Nikaea Edict, justifying his actions as necessary reconnaissance to confirm the scope of the threat he had detected. The Primarch's investigations revealed the full extent of Horus's corruption as he observed the War Master's interactions with demonic entities that had taken residence within his psyche. These beings whispered constant encouragement for rebellion and violence, feeding Horus's growing resentment toward the Emperor while simultaneously offering him power that seemed to dwarf anything the Imperium could provide. The psychic traces left by the Istvan III massacre created a psychic wound in the warp that Magnus could perceive from across the galaxy, a screaming rent in reality where the deaths of thousands of loyal space marines had torn through the barrier between dimensions. The sheer scale of the betrayal registered as a psychic shockwave that rippled through the immaterium, carrying with it the emotional resonance of absolute treachery and the birth of something new and terrible within the ranks of the Emperor's chosen warriors. Magnus witnessed the moment when Horus's transformation became irreversible, as the War Master's soul bound itself completely to the service of the Chaos Gods. The Crimson King's growing awareness of the conspiracy's scope revealed connections between multiple Primarchs and the influence of Chaos entities that had been working for decades to corrupt the Emperor's sons. Magnus observed psychic threads linking Lorgar to ancient powers that predated human civilization, while similar connections bound Fulgrim to entities that fed upon sensation and excess. The network of corruption extended throughout the galaxy like a vast web, with Horus serving as the focal point for a rebellion that would tear the Imperium apart from within. Magnus's internal struggle between loyalty to his father and his conviction that warning the Emperor justified breaking the psychic prohibition created a crisis that consumed his every waking moment. The Primarch understood that his use of psychic abilities violated the direct orders he had received at Nikaea, but the magnitude of the threat he had discovered seemed to dwarf such considerations. The Emperor's prohibition had been based on concerns about corruption and the dangers of uncontrolled psychic development, yet Magnus believed that his superior knowledge and careful preparation would allow him to avoid such pitfalls while serving the greater good. The Crimson King rationalized his decision through elaborate philosophical frameworks that portrayed his disobedience as the highest form of loyalty, arguing that blind adherence to orders in the face of existential threats represented a failure of duty rather than proper service. Magnus convinced himself that the Emperor would understand and forgive the violation once he learned of the intelligence that had been gathered through forbidden means, viewing his actions as a necessary sacrifice that demonstrated his commitment to protecting humanity from its greatest enemies. The preparation for the great sorcerous ritual required Magnus to gather his most powerful sorcerers from across the Thousand Suns Legion, summoning magisters and chief librarians who possessed both the psychic strength and theoretical knowledge necessary to participate in such an ambitious undertaking. These individuals had continued their studies despite the Nikaea Edict, maintaining their abilities through secret practice while officially serving in non-psychic roles within the Legion's structure. Magnus's call brought them together for the first time since the Council's conclusion, reuniting practitioners whose combined power represented the pinnacle of human psychic achievement. Azek Ahriman arrived at the ritual site with carefully concealed excitement, recognizing the opportunity to employ techniques that had been forbidden for years while serving what appeared to be the noblest of purposes. The chief librarian had spent the intervening time developing new theoretical frameworks for psychic manipulation, creating methods that promised unprecedented precision and control over warp energies. His research had incorporated elements from the forbidden texts that Magnus had shared with him, knowledge that originated from sources within the Immaterium itself and offered insights that conventional human understanding could never achieve. The other sorcerers who gathered for the ritual brought with them specializations that reflected the diverse approaches to psychic development that had emerged within the Thousand Suns prior to Nikaea. Magisters of the Corvidi Fellowship contributed their mastery of divination and temporal perception, while Piri sorcerers offered expertise in channeling destructive energies across impossible distances. The Pavoni brought knowledge of biomantic manipulation that could sustain the ritual's participants through the physical stresses of prolonged psychic exertion, while Raptora specialists provided the telekinetic control necessary to manage the complex geometric patterns that would focus the ritual's energies. Magnus selected Tizca's greatest pyramid as the focal point for his working, recognizing that the structure's crystalline composition and geometric perfection would serve as an ideal conduit for the psychic energies he intended to channel. The pyramid's internal chambers had been designed according to principles that enhanced psychic resonance, with each level corresponding to different aspects of warp manipulation and providing increasingly powerful amplification effects as practitioners ascended toward the apex. The building's very architecture reflected millennia of accumulated knowledge about the relationship between physical form and psychic function. The Primarch's preparations extended beyond the immediate ritual site to encompass Prospero's entire network of psychic nexus points, locations where the planet's natural energies converged to create areas of enhanced psychic potential. These sites had been identified and developed over centuries by Prospero's inhabitants, who had learned to tap into the planet's inherent properties to amplify their own abilities. Magnus intended to link these nexus points together through a complex web of psychic connections that would allow him to draw upon Prospero's accumulated power while simultaneously protecting the ritual from interference by hostile entities. The geometric patterns that Magnus inscribed throughout the ritual space incorporated symbols and formulae drawn from multiple sources, combining traditional human psychic theory with knowledge that had been revealed through his bargain with Tzinch. These designs served both practical and protective functions, creating channels through which psychic energy could flow while simultaneously establishing barriers against unwanted intrusion. The complexity of the patterns reflected the ambitious scope of Magnus's intended working, as he sought to project his consciousness across the galaxy with sufficient clarity and power to penetrate the Emperor's own psychic defenses. Tzinch's influence manifested subtly throughout the preparation process, guiding Magnus's decisions through carefully placed suggestions and apparent insights that seemed to originate from the Primarch's own intellect. The Chaos God had been manipulating events for decades to ensure that this moment would arrive, using the corruption of Horus and the threat to the Imperium as tools to drive Magnus toward the very actions that would complete his damnation. Each choice that Magnus made in preparing the ritual served Tzinch's ultimate purpose, though the Primarch remained convinced that he was acting according to his own free will and rational judgment. The Changer of Ways had orchestrated the timing of Magnus's discovery to coincide with the Primarch's growing desperation about his legion's situation and his resentment over the Nikaea Edict's restrictions. The Chaos God understood that Magnus's pride and intellectual arrogance made him particularly susceptible to the belief that he could control forces beyond mortal comprehension, using this weakness to encourage increasingly reckless behavior. Tzinch's whispers reinforced Magnus's conviction that his superior knowledge and careful preparation would allow him to succeed where others had failed, blinding the Primarch to the true consequences of his actions. The influence of the Chaos God extended to the other sorcerers participating in the ritual, though they remained largely unaware of the source of their enhanced abilities and insights. Each practitioner found their powers growing stronger as the preparation progressed, with new techniques and understanding flowing into their consciousness, as if arising from their own studies and meditation. These enhancements made the planned working seem not only possible, but inevitable, creating a sense of destiny that overrode any lingering doubts about the wisdom of violating the Emperor's explicit commands. Magnus's selection of the specific psychic techniques to be employed in the ritual drew heavily upon knowledge that he had gained through his pact with Tzinch, though he rationalized these choices as applications of theoretical principles that he had developed through independent research. The methods required unprecedented coordination between multiple powerful psychers, with each participant contributing specific elements to a working that would exceed anything previously attempted in human history. The complexity of the undertaking demanded absolute precision and perfect timing, as any failure could result in catastrophic psychic backlash that would destroy not only the participants, but potentially the entire planet. The Primarch's confidence in his ability to control the ritual's outcome reflected both his genuine expertise in psychic manipulation and the subtle influence of chaos entities that sought to ensure his eventual downfall. Magnus genuinely believed that his centuries of study and his unique position as the Emperor's son provided him with advantages that would allow him to avoid the pitfalls that had claimed other practitioners who had attempted similar workings. This conviction blinded him to the possibility that his very strengths might become weaknesses when employed in service of goals that aligned with the interests of humanity's greatest enemies. The gathering of psychic energy required for the ritual began days before the actual working commenced, as Magnus and his sorcerers performed preliminary exercises designed to attune themselves to Prospero's natural emanations and establish the connections necessary for channeling the planet's accumulated power. These preparatory rituals created increasingly intense psychic fields that began affecting the behavior of Prospero's wildlife and causing minor reality distortions in areas surrounding the nexus points. The effects served as both indicators of the working's growing power and warnings of the forces that were being unleashed. The final preparations for Magnus's great working reached their crescendo as Prospero's crystalline spires began resonating with accumulated psychic energy that had been building for days. The air itself seemed to thicken with potential as reality grew increasingly malleable around the ritual sites, creating distortions that made straight lines appear curved and caused shadows to move independently of their sources. The planet's psychic nexus points pulsed with synchronized rhythms that matched the collective heartbeat of the assembled sorcerers, while the Great Pyramid of Tizca blazed with an inner light that was visible from orbit. Magnus stood at the apex of the pyramid's ritual chamber, his towering form surrounded by intricate geometric patterns that had been carved directly into the crystalline floor, using techniques that combined traditional craftsmanship with psychic manipulation. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe when viewed peripherally, their meaning changing based on the observer's level of psychic sensitivity and understanding. Each glyph represented years of theoretical research and practical experimentation, incorporating knowledge that had been gathered from across the galaxy and refined through centuries of careful study. The assembled Thousand Suns sorcerers took their positions at carefully calculated points throughout the chamber, their placement determined by complex mathematical formulae that accounted for their individual psychic signatures and specialized abilities. Azek Ahriman positioned himself at the primary resonance node, his role as chief librarian making him the natural coordinator for the working's multiple components. The other magisters arranged themselves according to their fellowship affiliations, creating a living mandala of psychic power that reflected the Legion's organizational structure and theoretical approaches to warp manipulation. The ritual began with subtle harmonics that seemed to emerge from the pyramid's crystal structure itself, frequencies that resonated with the participants' enhanced nervous systems and gradually synchronized their brain patterns into a collective consciousness. Magnus's voice joined the growing chorus, speaking words in languages that predated human civilization and carried meanings that could only be fully comprehended by minds touched by the warp's chaotic energies. The incantations drew upon knowledge that the Primarch had acquired through his bargain with Tzeentch, though he remained convinced that his understanding of their true nature protected him from their corrupting influence. The psychic energies building within the chamber began manifesting physical effects as the temperature dropped several degrees, and the air became charged with static electricity that made exposed skin tingle and caused metal objects to spark spontaneously. The geometric patterns carved into the floor began glowing with their own internal light, creating a web of interconnected lines that pulsed in rhythm with the participants' collective heartbeat. Reality itself seemed to become more fluid within the ritual space, as the boundary between the material universe and the immaterium grew increasingly thin. Magnus reached out with his consciousness to establish connections with Prospero's planetary network of psychic nexus points, drawing upon centuries of accumulated spiritual energy that had been stored within the planet's crystalline formations. The process required delicate manipulation, as the Primarch worked to channel these vast forces without allowing them to overwhelm his own psychic defenses or those of his fellow sorcerers. Each connection established scent tremors through the warp that could be felt across multiple star systems, creating ripples in the immaterium that attracted the attention of entities that dwelled within its chaotic depths. The Changer of Ways observed the ritual's progress with satisfaction that transcended mortal understanding, recognizing that Magnus's actions were fulfilling prophecies that had been set in motion millennia before the Primarch's birth. Tzeentch's influence guided the working's development through subtle manipulations that appeared to be natural consequences of the forces being employed, ensuring that each step brought Magnus closer to the catastrophic outcome that the Chaos God desired. The entity's power flowed through the ritual structure like poison through veins, corrupting the working's fundamental nature while remaining invisible to even Magnus's enhanced perception. The psychic projection that Magnus began constructing represented the culmination of theoretical research that had occupied the greatest minds of Prospero for generations, a technique that would allow his consciousness to traverse the galaxy instantaneously while maintaining sufficient coherence to communicate complex information. The working required unprecedented precision, as the Primarch shaped his astral form according to mathematical principles that accounted for the distorting effects of warp travel and the interference patterns created by the galaxy's psychic background radiation. Each adjustment demanded perfect coordination between Magnus's conscious will and the instinctive responses of his enhanced nervous system. The projection's initial manifestation appeared as a translucent duplicate of Magnus's physical form, though composed entirely of crystallized psychic energy that refracted light in patterns that hurt to observe directly. The astral body possessed all of the Primarch's memories and intellectual capabilities while being freed from the limitations imposed by physical matter, allowing it to move through the immaterium at speeds that reduced interstellar distances to negligible obstacles. The construction process required constant reinforcement from the assembled sorcerers, whose combined psychic output provided the energy necessary to maintain the projection's stability across impossible distances. The moment of launch sent shockwaves through both the material universe and the warp, as Magnus's consciousness departed Prospero with the force of a psychic thunderclap that shattered crystal formations throughout Tizca and caused sensitive individuals across the planet to collapse from psychic overload. The projection tore through the immaterium like a comet of pure thought, its passage creating turbulence that disrupted astropathic communications throughout the segmentum and caused navigator houses to lose contact with vessels that were traveling through affected regions. The sheer magnitude of the working exceeded anything previously attempted by human psychers, creating phenomena that registered on psychic detection equipment across half the galaxy. Magnus's journey through the warp revealed the true extent of the corruption that was spreading through the Imperium's military forces, as his enhanced perception detected the psychic signatures of traitor legions that were already moving toward their assigned positions for the coming rebellion. The Primarch observed fleets massing in systems that had been chosen for their strategic value, while communication intercepts revealed coordination between forces that should have been operating independently. The scope of Horus's conspiracy became clear as Magnus traced the connections between corrupted commanders and the chaos entities that were guiding their actions. The projection's passage through the immaterium attracted the attention of demonic entities that recognized Magnus's psychic signature and sought to interfere with his mission through direct assault or subtle misdirection. These creatures manifested as geometric impossibilities that defied three-dimensional visualization, beings of pure malevolence that existed only to corrupt and destroy anything touched by order or purpose. Magnus fought off their attacks through applications of theoretical knowledge that allowed him to manipulate the fundamental forces governing the warp's chaotic nature, though each confrontation drained energy that he could not afford to lose. The approach to Terra required navigating psychic defenses that the Emperor had established around the Sol system, barriers of crystallized will that were designed to prevent unauthorized access by hostile entities or corrupted psykers. Magnus's projection encountered these defenses as walls of golden fire that burned with the intensity of stellar cores, protective measures that would have instantly destroyed any lesser consciousness that attempted to penetrate them. The Primarch's status as the Emperor's son provided him with partial immunity to these safeguards, though forcing passage still required expenditure of psychic energy that left his astral form visibly diminished. The Imperial Palace's psychic architecture revealed itself to Magnus's enhanced perception as a vast mandala of interconnected chambers and passages that had been designed according to principles that combined advanced technology with esoteric knowledge drawn from humanity's prehistoric past. The structure's deeper levels contained machinery that operated on principles that transcended conventional physics, devices that manipulated space and time through applications of controlled psychic energy. The Primarch recognized elements of the construction that corresponded to theoretical frameworks he had studied, though the Emperor's implementation exceeded anything that Prospero's scholars had imagined possible. Magnus's consciousness penetrated the palace's outer defenses and began descending through layers of reality that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, following psychic resonances that led toward the source of his father's overwhelming presence. The journey required constant adjustment as the projection navigated through spaces where the normal laws of physics had been suspended or replaced by alternative systems that operated according to the Emperor's will. Each level revealed new wonders and terrors as Magnus observed the true scope of his father's secret project and began to understand the magnitude of what was being attempted beneath Terra's surface. The discovery of the Imperial Webway project struck Magnus like a physical blow as his consciousness encountered the vast portal that the Emperor had been constructing in absolute secrecy for decades. The gate represented humanity's potential liberation from dependence on warp travel and the dangers inherent in navigating the immaterium, a technological achievement that would fundamentally alter the species' relationship with the galaxy and eliminate many of the threats that had plagued human civilization since its earliest expansion into space. The project's scope and ambition dwarfed anything that Magnus had imagined possible, revealing his father as a being whose vision extended far beyond the immediate concerns of the Great Crusade. The psychic barriers protecting the Webway Gate appeared to Magnus's perception as geometric patterns of impossible complexity, mathematical structures that existed in dimensions beyond normal spatial relationships, and incorporated theoretical principles that challenged even his enhanced understanding. These defenses had been crafted through applications of knowledge that predated human civilization, drawing upon secrets that the Emperor had acquired during his millennia of existence and study. The barriers represented the culmination of psychic engineering that had required centuries of careful construction and constant maintenance to achieve their current level of sophistication. Magnus's projection struck the Webway's defenses with the accumulated force of Prospero's entire psychic output, channeled through theoretical frameworks that the Primarch believed would allow him to penetrate any barrier through precise application of overwhelming power. The impact created a psychic explosion that registered across multiple dimensions simultaneously, sending shockwaves through both the material universe and the immaterium that disrupted delicate equilibriums that had been maintained for millennia. The collision between Magnus's projection and the Emperor's defenses generated energies that exceeded the containment capabilities of the protective systems, creating cascading failures that propagated throughout the entire structure. The barrier's collapse opened a wound in reality itself, as the carefully maintained separation between the Webway and the warp suddenly vanished, allowing the chaotic energies of the immaterium to pour into spaces that had been designed to exclude their influence entirely. Demonic entities that had been held at bay by the Emperor's psychic will suddenly found themselves with direct access to the Imperial Palace's deepest levels, manifesting in swarms that threatened to overwhelm even the enhanced defenses that protected Terra's most critical installations. The breach created a permanent gateway between dimensions that would require constant vigilance to prevent from expanding beyond controllable limits. The Emperor's rage at the destruction of his greatest work manifested as a psychic storm that swept through the palace's corridors and caused reality distortions that affected every living being within the structure's boundaries. His fury transcended normal emotional responses and became a force of nature that warped space and time around its source, creating effects that registered on instruments throughout the Sol system and caused sensitive individuals across Terra to experience prophetic visions of coming catastrophe. The Master of Mankind's reaction revealed the true extent of his investment in the Webway project and the magnitude of the setback that Magnus's actions had created. The psychic backlash from the barrier's destruction struck Magnus's projection with force that exceeded anything the Primarch had experienced during his centuries of warp exploration, fragmenting his consciousness into multiple components that were scattered across different dimensional planes. The trauma of this separation created wounds in Magnus's psyche that would never fully heal, leaving him vulnerable to influences that had previously been unable to affect his disciplined mind. Parts of his awareness became trapped within the immaterium itself, where they would be subjected to constant assault by demonic entities seeking to claim them for their own purposes. The fragmentation of Magnus's psyche manifested physically as his body on Prospero began experiencing spontaneous mutations that reflected the damage his consciousness had sustained during the working's catastrophic conclusion. His flesh rippled with changes that followed no biological pattern, creating temporary appendages and sensory organs that appeared and vanished according to the fluctuations in his scattered awareness. The transformations caused excruciating pain that transcended physical sensation and touched directly upon the fundamental nature of his existence as a conscious being. The other Thousand Sons sorcerers participating in the ritual suffered their own forms of psychic trauma as the working's failure sent feedback through the connections they had established with their Primarch's consciousness. Several magisters collapsed immediately as their minds were overwhelmed by energies that exceeded their ability to process or contain, while others began manifesting the same type of spontaneous mutations that were affecting Magnus himself. The pyramid's crystal structure cracked and shattered as the accumulated psychic energy discharged chaotically, creating a psychic wound in Prospero's surface that would attract demonic attention for years to come. Azek Ahriman maintained consciousness longer than most of his fellow sorcerers, his enhanced mental defenses allowing him to observe the working's failure and understand its implications for both the Legion and the wider Imperium. The chief librarian witnessed Magnus's fragmentation through their psychic link and recognized that the damage extended beyond immediate physical effects to encompass fundamental alterations in the Primarch's essential nature. The knowledge that their gene father had been permanently changed by his attempt to serve the Emperor created a crisis of faith that would influence Ahriman's future decisions and drive him toward increasingly desperate measures. The scattered fragments of Magnus's consciousness began attracting the attention of warp entities that recognized the opportunity presented by a damaged Primarch psyche, beings that sought to claim pieces of his awareness for their own purposes or use them as anchors for manifesting within the material universe. These creatures whispered promises of restoration and revenge, offering to help Magnus rebuild his shattered mind in exchange for services that seemed minor compared to the magnitude of his loss. The constant assault on his fragmented awareness made coherent thought increasingly difficult and left him vulnerable to suggestions that he would normally have recognized as obvious manipulation. The immediate aftermath of the ritual's failure left Prospero in a state of psychic chaos as the planet's crystalline formations continued resonating with the energies that had been unleashed during Magnus's working. Reality distortions affected large areas of the planet's surface, creating zones where the normal laws of physics operated differently or not at all. The population centers experienced widespread panic as sensitive individuals, received fragmentary visions of the catastrophe that had occurred within the Great Pyramid, though few understood the true significance of what they had witnessed. The damage to the Imperial Webway project forced the Emperor to abandon his laboratory beneath the palace and take direct control of the psychic defenses that were now required to prevent demonic incursion into Terra's most critical installations. The Master of Mankind's consciousness became locked in constant battle, with entities seeking to exploit the breach that Magnus had created, a struggle that would consume his attention and prevent him from taking direct action in the coming civil war. The loss of the Emperor's active leadership at such a critical moment represented a strategic catastrophe that would have consequences extending far beyond the immediate crisis. The psychic shockwave from Magnus's catastrophic breach of the Imperial Webway reached across the galaxy like ripples in a disturbed pond, its effects registering on astropathic equipment and causing sensitive individuals throughout Imperial space to experience momentary visions of golden fire and crystalline destruction. On the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, Horus Lupercal felt the disturbance as a cold touch against his consciousness, recognizing the psychic signature of his brother Magnus despite the corruption that now clouded his own perceptions. The War Master's enhanced senses detected the pain and fragmentation within that familiar presence, understanding immediately that something of tremendous significance had occurred on distant Prospero. The timing of Magnus's psychic catastrophe could not have been more fortuitous for Horus's plans, as the War Master had been expecting communication from Terra regarding the Thousand Sons Legion and their continued violations of the Nikaea Edict. Intelligence reports filtered through his network of corrupted officials had indicated that the Emperor was growing increasingly concerned about psychic activities on Prospero, with several Mechanicus monitoring stations detecting energy signatures that suggested large-scale sorcerous workings. The evidence pointed towards systematic defiance of imperial law that would demand swift and decisive response from the throne. The astropathic message from Terra arrived within hours of the psychic disturbance, its priority codes indicating direct transmission from the Imperial Palace itself. Horus received the communication in his private chambers aboard the Vengeful Spirit, dismissing his attendants and activating privacy shields that would prevent any unauthorized observation of the message's contents. The War Master's corrupted nature allowed him to perceive subtle details within the transmission that normal recipients would miss, including emotional undertones that revealed the sender's mental state and the circumstances surrounding the message's composition. The Emperor's original orders carried the weight of absolute authority and barely contained fury, though they remained precisely crafted to ensure proper understanding and implementation. The message detailed Magnus's violation of the Nikaea Edict through his attempted psychic contact with Terra, describing the catastrophic damage inflicted upon critical Imperial installations and the ongoing threat posed by the breach in reality that the Crimson King's actions had created. The Emperor's words conveyed his disappointment and anger at his son's disobedience, but they also reflected his understanding of Magnus's likely motivations and his desire to preserve the possibility of redemption. The directive specified that Magnus was to be brought to Terra immediately to face judgment for his actions, with the Thousand Sons Legion to be disbanded and its members reassigned to other formations where their psychic abilities could be properly monitored and controlled. The orders emphasized the importance of capturing Magnus alive, as the Emperor required direct testimony about the circumstances that had led to such a catastrophic breach of trust and discipline. The message included detailed intelligence about Prospero's defenses and the likely disposition of Thousand Sons forces, information that would be essential for planning the complex operation required to apprehend a Primarch without destroying him in the process. Horus studied the transmission with growing satisfaction as he recognized the opportunity that the Emperor's orders presented for advancing his own rebellion. The War Master understood that Magnus's capture would remove one of the most powerful Primarchs from the galactic chessboard, while simultaneously eliminating a potential threat to his own plans for overthrowing Imperial authority. The Thousand Sons Legion's psychic abilities made them dangerous opponents who could potentially detect the corruption spreading through the traitor forces, making their neutralization a strategic necessity for the coming civil war. The War Master's analysis of the situation revealed multiple advantages that could be gained through careful manipulation of the Emperor's orders and the selection of appropriate forces to carry them out. The operation would require a legion with the strength and determination necessary to assault a heavily defended world and overcome the formidable obstacles that Prospero's psychic defenders would present. More importantly, the chosen force would need to be commanded by a Primarch whose loyalty to the Emperor remained absolute, ensuring that the mission would be carried out regardless of any personal relationships or political considerations that might otherwise interfere. Leman Russ emerged as the obvious choice for leading the sanction against Prospero, as the Wolf King's hatred of psychers and his unwavering devotion to the Emperor made him the ideal instrument for carrying out such a distasteful but necessary task. The Space Wolves Legion possessed both the military capability and the psychological disposition required for confronting sorcerers and their demon allies, having developed specialized tactics and equipment specifically designed for combating enemies who employed warp-based powers. Russ's personal animosity toward Magnus would ensure that he approached the mission with the ruthless determination necessary for success. The War Master began crafting his manipulation of the Emperor's orders with the subtle skill that had made him such an effective commander during the Great Crusade, understanding that direct alteration of the message would be too easily detected by the Wolf King's advisors. Instead, Horus focused on the emotional context surrounding the transmission and the interpretation of specific phrases that could be understood in multiple ways depending on the recipient's preconceptions and psychological state. The key lay in exploiting Russ's existing prejudices and his tendency to view complex situations through the lens of personal honor and martial necessity. The modified transmission that reached Fenris retained the Emperor's original words while being accompanied by additional context that fundamentally altered their meaning and intent. Horus's accompanying message presented Magnus's actions as part of a broader pattern of corruption that threatened the stability of the entire Imperium, suggesting that the Crimson King's psychic abilities had been compromised by the same demonic influences that were spreading throughout the galaxy. The War Master's analysis portrayed the situation as an immediate existential threat that required decisive action to prevent further contamination of loyal Imperial forces. The supplementary intelligence that Horus provided painted Prospero as a world that had fallen completely under the sway of chaos entities, with the Thousand Suns Legion serving as willing accomplices in their patron deity's plans for corrupting the wider Imperium. The reports described sorcerous rituals conducted on a planetary scale and the presence of demonic entities that had been summoned to serve as advisors and allies to Magnus's forces. These fabricated details transformed the mission from a law enforcement operation into a holy war against the fundamental enemies of humanity. Horus's masterstroke involved subtle alterations to the technical specifications included with the Emperor's orders, changing references to apprehension and transport into language that could be interpreted as authorization for termination and elimination. The modifications were crafted to appear as transmission errors or encoding artifacts that might naturally occur during long-range astropathic communication, providing plausible deniability while fundamentally altering the mission's objectives. The changes ensured that Russ would interpret the orders as a mandate for Magnus's execution rather than his capture. The psychological manipulation extended beyond the message itself to encompass the circumstances of its delivery and the supporting materials that accompanied the transmission. Horus arranged for the orders to arrive during a period when Fenris was experiencing severe warp storms that disrupted normal communication protocols, creating an atmosphere of urgency and isolation that would prevent Russ from seeking clarification through alternative channels. The timing ensured that the Wolf King would be forced to act based solely on the information provided without the opportunity for verification or consultation. Leman Russ received the corrupted orders in the Great Hall of the Fang, surrounded by his senior commanders and the most respected members of his legion's warrior culture. The Wolf King's initial reaction reflected his complex relationship with his brother Magnus, as personal dislike warred with ingrained respect for the bonds that connected all of the Emperor's sons. However, the evidence presented in Horus's fabricated intelligence reports quickly overwhelmed any lingering doubts about the necessity of decisive action against what appeared to be a clear and present threat to imperial security. The Space Wolves Primarch's interpretation of the orders was influenced by his fundamental worldview and his understanding of duty as absolute obedience to legitimate authority. Russ had never questioned the Emperor's judgment in matters of strategic importance, viewing his father's wisdom as transcending mortal comprehension and deserving of complete trust, regardless of personal feelings or preferences. The apparent magnitude of Magnus's betrayal struck the Wolf King as a violation so profound that it demanded the ultimate sanction, confirming his belief that sorcery inevitably led to corruption and damnation. The Wolf King's acceptance of the mission reflected his genuine conviction that Magnus had fallen beyond redemption and posed an active threat to everything that the Imperium represented. Russ's experiences during the Great Crusade had exposed him to numerous examples of psychic corruption and demonic influence, creating a mental framework that made Horus's fabricated intelligence seem entirely plausible. The Space Wolves Primarch viewed the orders as validation of his long-held beliefs about the dangers of uncontrolled psychic development and the inevitable consequences of trafficking with warp entities. The planning phase for the Prospero operation began immediately as Russ summoned his Great Company commanders and began the complex process of organizing a full-scale planetary assault. The Space Wolves Legion possessed extensive experience in siege warfare and urban combat, having participated in numerous compliance actions during the Great Crusade that required the systematic reduction of heavily fortified positions. The commanders understood that Prospero would present unique challenges due to the psychic abilities of its defenders, necessitating specialized tactics and equipment that could counter sorcerous attacks and provide protection against warp-based phenomena. Each great company brought specific capabilities that would contribute to the overall success of the mission, with their diverse specializations reflecting the Space Wolves' adaptation to the varied environments and enemies encountered during their expansion across the galaxy. The assault companies possessed the heavy weapons and armored vehicles necessary for breaching Prospero's crystal cities, while the reconnaissance formations would provide intelligence about enemy dispositions and identify priority targets for elimination. The void warfare specialists would ensure orbital supremacy and prevent any attempt by the Thousand Suns to escape or receive reinforcement. The recruitment of Imperial Army support required careful coordination with military commands throughout the surrounding sectors, as the operation's scale demanded resources that exceeded what a single legion could provide independently. Russ's requests for additional forces were approved with unusual speed, reflecting the priority that Terra placed on the mission's success and the resources that the Emperor was willing to commit to resolving the Magnus situation. The supporting formations included specialized units trained in combating psychers and dealing with the aftermath of large-scale psychic phenomena. The Legio Mortis Titan Legion received deployment orders that would bring their massive war engines to bear against Prospero's defenses, their void shields and heavy weapons providing the firepower necessary to reduce even the strongest fortifications to rubble. The Titan's machine spirits had been consecrated with specific rites designed to protect them from psychic attack, while their crews underwent additional training in recognizing and countering the illusions and mental influences that enemy sorcerers might attempt to employ. The presence of these god machines would ensure that no defensive position on Prospero could withstand the assault for extended periods. The Adeptus Custodes contingent assigned to the operation brought with them weapons and equipment specifically designed for combating enemies who employed warp-based powers, including specialized ammunition that could disrupt psychic phenomena and protective gear that provided enhanced resistance to mental influence. These elite warriors possessed training in anti-psyker tactics that had been developed over millennia of protecting the Emperor from supernatural threats, making them invaluable assets for an operation that would inevitably involve close combat with powerful sorcerers. The Sisters of Silence represented perhaps the most crucial component of the assault force, as their unique nature as psychic nulls would provide protection against the most dangerous aspects of the Thousand Suns' abilities. These warrior women could create zones of psychic dead space that would neutralize enemy sorcerers and prevent the manifestation of demonic entities, giving the Imperial forces a decisive advantage in areas where they could establish their presence. Their participation in the operation reflected the Emperor's understanding of the specific threats that Magnus and his legion represented. The logistical preparations for the Prospero campaign required months of careful planning as supply convoys assembled the massive quantities of equipment and materials necessary to support a prolonged siege operation. The specialized nature of the mission demanded unusual supplies, including psychically inert materials for constructing temporary fortifications and large quantities of sanctified ammunition that could harm entities that existed partially within the warp. The preparation phase also included the construction of specialized containment facilities that could hold captured sorcerers while preventing them from employing their abilities to escape or communicate with their allies. Russ's final preparations included personal consultations with the Space Wolves rune priests, seeking their insights into the nature of the threats that the assault force would face on Prospero and the most effective methods for countering sorcerous attacks. These discussions reinforced the Wolf King's conviction that Magnus had fallen to corruption, as his own psychers described sensing a growing taint surrounding the Thousand Suns Legion that suggested extensive contact with demonic entities. The rune priest's warnings about the dangers of prolonged exposure to corrupted psychic phenomena influenced Russ's tactical planning and his determination to complete the mission as quickly as possible. The Wolf King's interpretation of his orders as a mandate for Magnus's execution, rather than capture, reflected both his personal prejudices and his genuine belief that such drastic action was necessary to prevent further corruption from spreading throughout the Imperium. Russ viewed the mission as a test of his loyalty and a demonstration of his willingness to place duty above personal relationships, understanding that the Emperor's trust in him demanded absolute obedience regardless of the emotional cost. The Space Wolves Primarch convinced himself that Magnus's death would serve as both punishment for his crimes and protection for the wider human species. The Space Wolves fleet emerged from the warp at the edge of the Prospero system, like a pack of predators scenting wounded prey. The massive flotilla stretched across several thousand kilometers of void space, its composition reflecting the diverse military assets that the Emperor had authorized for this unprecedented sanction against one of his own sons. At the fleet's heart rode the Hrafnkel, Leman Russ's flagship, its hull scarred by decades of void warfare and adorned with the pelts and totems that marked it as the vessel of Fenris's greatest warrior. The Wolf King stood upon his command bridge, his massive frame draped in the ceremonial furs and battle-worn armor that proclaimed his status as both Primarch and tribal chieftain. Russ's weathered features bore the grim expression of a man who had accepted a distasteful but necessary duty, his pale blue eyes fixed upon the tactical displays that showed Prospero's orbital defenses and the disposition of Thousand Suns vessels. The intelligence reports provided by Horus had painted a picture of a world consumed by corruption, where ancient knowledge had been twisted into blasphemous sorcery that threatened the very foundations of Imperial civilization. Accompanying the Space Wolves were elements of the Adeptus Custodes, their golden armor gleaming beneath the harsh illumination of the fleet's running lights. These warriors represented the Emperor's personal will made manifest, their presence serving both as reinforcement for the assault and as a reminder of the authority behind the mission's objectives. Captain General Constantin Valdor had personally selected the Custodes contingent, choosing warriors whose experience in combating supernatural threats made them ideally suited for confronting the psychic powers that the Thousand Sons would undoubtedly employ in their defense. The Sisters of Silence maintained their own vessels within the fleet formation, their ships equipped with specialized systems designed to project fields of psychic nullification across vast distances. These warrior women represented perhaps the most crucial element of the assault force, as their unique nature as blanks would provide protection against the sorcerous abilities that made the Thousand Sons such formidable opponents. Their silent presence aboard the fleet created zones of psychic dead space that disrupted astropathic communications and caused unease among the more sensitive members of the expedition's personnel. Russ's tactical assessment of Prospero's defenses revealed a world that had been transformed into a fortress of crystalline spires and psychic resonance chambers, each structure designed to amplify the inhabitants' supernatural abilities while providing protection against conventional assault. The planet's orbital installations included monitoring stations and communication arrays that could detect approaching threats from across the system, though their reliance on psychic enhancement made them vulnerable to the nullification fields that the Sisters of Silence projected. The Wolf King recognized that speed and overwhelming force would be essential to prevent the defenders from coordinating an effective response. The initial phase of the assault began with a systematic bombardment of Prospero's orbital infrastructure, as Space Wolves' heavy cruisers and battleships targeted the monitoring stations and defensive platforms that protected the planet's approaches. The bombardment employed specialized munitions that had been blessed by the fleet's rune priests, their warheads designed to disrupt psychic phenomena while delivering conventional explosive force. The destruction of these installations created gaps in Prospero's early warning network that would prevent the Thousand Sons from detecting the full scope of the approaching threat until it was too late to mount an organized defense. Prospero's surface installations began registering massive energy signatures as the bombardment commenced, their crystalline structures resonating with the impact of orbital strikes like vast musical instruments struck by giant hammers. The planet's psychic nexus points detected the approaching fleet through methods that transcended conventional sensors, sending waves of alarm through the Thousand Sons garrison as they recognized the distinctive psychic signatures of their attackers. The realization that their own brothers had come to destroy them created a psychological shock that paralyzed many defenders and prevented coordinated resistance during the crucial early moments of the assault. The Space Wolves fleet moved into close orbital positions with the practiced efficiency of warriors who had conducted countless planetary assaults during the Great Crusade. Each vessel took up predetermined firing positions that maximized their coverage of Prospero's major population centers while minimizing the risk of fratricidal fire between friendly units. The fleet's heavy weapons began the systematic destruction of Tizca's outer defenses, their massive shells and energy beams reducing crystalline towers to glowing rubble that continued to pulse with residual psychic energy long after their destruction. Magnus the Red remained in his tower sanctuary as the bombardment commenced, his fragmented consciousness struggling to comprehend the reality of what was occurring around him. The Crimson King's psychic awareness detected the approaching threat long before conventional sensors could identify specific vessels, but his shattered mental state prevented him from taking the decisive action that might have organized an effective defense. The guilt and self-recrimination that consumed Magnus following his catastrophic breach of the Imperial webway had convinced him that he deserved whatever punishment his father chose to inflict, making him unable to order his sons to resist what he perceived as justified retribution. The Thousand Sons Legion found themselves leaderless at the moment when leadership was most desperately needed, as their Primarch's withdrawal into guilt-ridden isolation left them without clear orders or strategic direction. The various cult fellowships attempted to coordinate their own responses to the attack, but their specialized training had focused on sorcerous techniques rather than conventional military tactics. The Corvidae Fellowship's precognitive abilities provided fragmentary warnings about the assault's progression, while the Raptora used their telekinetic powers to deflect some of the incoming orbital strikes, but these individual efforts lacked the coordination necessary to mount an effective planetary defense. Ozek Ahriman emerged as the de facto commander of Prospero's defenders, as other senior officers either sought shelter or attempted to reach Magnus in his tower retreat. The chief librarian's enhanced psychic abilities allowed him to perceive the full scope of the attacking fleet while simultaneously coordinating with scattered Thousand Suns units across the planet's surface. Ahriman's tactical assessment revealed the hopelessness of their situation, as the attackers possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and specialized equipment designed specifically for combating psychers, but his loyalty to his legion and his homeworld demanded that he organize whatever resistance was possible. The orbital bombardment targeted Prospero's great libraries with particular intensity, as if the attackers sought to erase not only the planet's defenders, but also the accumulated knowledge that they had spent centuries gathering. Ancient texts that contained the wisdom of civilizations that had vanished before humanity's rise to prominence disappeared in moments, as crystalline repositories collapsed beneath the weight of explosive shells and energy beams. The destruction of these irreplaceable archives represented a cultural catastrophe that exceeded even the immediate military significance of the assault, as millennia of accumulated learning vanished in flames that burned with unnatural colors due to the psychic energies released by the damaged crystal formations. The Spireguard regiments that served as Prospero's mortal military forces attempted to coordinate anti-orbital fire using weapon systems that had been enhanced through psychic manipulation, but their efforts proved largely ineffective against the specialized defenses employed by the attacking fleet. The enhanced ammunition that the defenders employed created spectacular light displays as it interacted with the void shields protecting the Space Wolves vessels, but the psychic energies that gave these weapons their unusual properties also made them vulnerable to the nullification fields projected by the Sisters of Silence. The mortal defenders found their most effective weapons rendered useless by an enemy that seemed specifically prepared to counter every aspect of Prospero's defensive capabilities. The first wave of drop pods began their descent toward Tizca's outer districts as the orbital bombardment shifted to support the ground assault, their armored hulls glowing cherry red from atmospheric friction as they plunged through Prospero's thin atmosphere. Each pod contained a squad of Space Wolves veterans, whose equipment had been specifically selected for combating psychers, including specialized ammunition that could disrupt psychic phenomena and protective charms that provided limited resistance to mental influence. The pod's targeting systems had been programmed to avoid the most heavily defended areas of the city, while establishing landing zones that would allow for rapid consolidation and advance toward primary objectives. The impact of the first drop pods sent tremors through Tizca's crystal foundations as their mass reactive warheads detonated against the city's geometric streets, creating craters that disrupted the carefully planned psychic resonance patterns that enhanced the defenders' abilities. Space Wolves assault marines emerged from the smoking pods with weapons ready, their enhanced senses immediately detecting the otherworldly atmosphere that pervaded the Crystal City. The warriors' training had prepared them for the disorienting effects of fighting in an environment saturated with psychic energy, but the reality of Prospero's alien architecture and the constant whisper of warp-touched voices proved more disturbing than their briefings had suggested. The Thousand Suns defenders who responded to the initial landings found themselves facing enemies who seemed immune to many of their most effective combat techniques, as the Space Wolves' specialized equipment and training neutralized psychic attacks that would have devastated conventional opponents. The Pavoni Fellowship's biomantic abilities proved particularly ineffective against warriors whose armor incorporated protective wards, and whose enhanced physiology had been further augmented through ritual scarification and runic tattoos. The frustrated sorcerers were forced to rely on conventional weapons and tactics for which they had received limited training, placing them at a severe disadvantage against opponents who excelled in close combat. Successive waves of drop pods continued their descent as the Space Wolves established expanding perimeters around their initial landing zones, each wave bringing additional specialized equipment and personnel needed for the systematic reduction of Prospero's defenses. Heavy weapons teams deployed anti-psyker devices that created zones of psychic interference, while assault specialists began the dangerous work of clearing the crystal spires that served as strongpoints for the defending sorcerers. The attackers moved with methodical efficiency that reflected centuries of experience in siege warfare, advancing through Tizca's streets with the inexorable determination of a natural disaster. The Sisters of Silence contingent deployed directly into Tizca's central districts, using specialized transport craft that could penetrate the psychic interference generated by the city's damaged crystal formations. These warrior women moved through the battlefield like living voids, their presence creating areas where psychic phenomena simply ceased to function and reality reasserted its normal parameters. Thousand Sons sorcerers who encountered the Sisters found their abilities completely neutralized, reducing them to the level of normal humans facing superhuman opponents in an environment that had suddenly become hostile to their very existence. The Adeptus Custodes forces concentrated their assault on the approaches to Magnus's tower, recognizing that their primary objective lay in securing or eliminating the Crimson King before he could rally his scattered forces or attempt to escape through psychic means. These golden-armored warriors advanced through Prospero's streets with the measured pace of beings who had never known defeat, their guardian spears and sentinel blades cutting through defensive positions that had been established by increasingly desperate Thousand Sons commanders. The Custodes' presence on the battlefield served as a visible reminder of the Emperor's will and the ultimate authority behind the sanction that was destroying Prospero. The systematic destruction of Tizca's great libraries continued throughout the ground assault, as Space Wolves' demolition teams employed specialized charges designed to ensure complete destruction of any materials that might contain dangerous knowledge. Ancient tomes that had survived the collapse of human civilization during the Age of Strife disappeared in flames that burned with colors that had no names in human languages, their destruction creating psychic echoes that could be felt across the entire planet. The loss of these irreplaceable works represented the elimination of knowledge that might have advanced human understanding of the universe by millennia, but the attackers viewed such considerations as secondary to the necessity of preventing corrupted information from spreading throughout the Imperium. Magnus remained isolated in his tower sanctuary as the battle raged around him, his consciousness trapped in cycles of self-recrimination and despair that prevented him from taking action to defend his world or his sons. The Crimson King's fragmented psyche struggled to process the reality of the assault while simultaneously dealing with the constant whispers of demonic entities that sought to exploit his weakened mental state. The voices promised power and revenge if he would only embrace the gifts they offered, but Magnus's remaining loyalty to the Emperor and his horror at the consequences of his previous bargains made him resistant to their blandishments even as his world burned around him. The advancing Space Wolves encountered increasingly desperate resistance as they pushed deeper into Tizca's central districts, where the surviving Thousand Sons had consolidated their remaining forces around key defensive positions. The crystal architecture that had once enhanced the defenders' psychic abilities now worked against them, as the damaged structures created unpredictable energy discharges and reality distortions that affected friend and foe alike. The battlefield became a nightmare landscape where the normal laws of physics operated inconsistently, and where the boundary between the material universe and the warp grew increasingly thin. The crystal spires of Tizca blazed with unnatural fire as the Space Wolves' assault forces pushed deeper into the heart of Prospero's capital city. The systematic bombardment had shattered the outer defensive rings, leaving twisted remains of crystalline architecture that still pulsed with residual psychic energy. Broken towers jutted from the rubble like the bones of some vast beast, their fractured surfaces reflecting the flames that consumed the great libraries and research centers that had once been the pride of Magnus's domain. The air itself seemed to thicken with each passing hour, as the boundary between reality and the warp grew increasingly unstable, creating distortions that made straight lines appear curved and caused shadows to move independently of their sources. Leman Russ led the primary assault column through Tizca's main thoroughfares, his massive form cutting through the psychic interference that surrounded the city's central districts like a ship pushing through turbulent waters. The Wolf King's presence served as an anchor point for his warriors, his natural resistance to psychic manipulation providing a zone of relative stability in an environment where reality itself had become unreliable. His frost-encrusted armor bore fresh scars from encounters with Thousand Sons sorcerers who had attempted to stop his advance through direct psychic assault, their attacks leaving crystalline formations across his ceramite plates that glowed with internal light. The space wolves who followed their Primarch moved with the coordinated efficiency of pack hunters, their enhanced senses allowing them to navigate the treacherous terrain despite the visual distortions created by damaged psychic resonance chambers. Each warrior carried specialized equipment designed for combating enemies who employed warp-based abilities, including ammunition blessed by Fenris's rune priests and protective talismans carved from the bones of creatures that had never existed fully in the material universe. Their bolt rounds exploded with bursts of psychically inert energy that disrupted sorcerous shields and caused reality distortions to collapse back into normal space-time. The Thousand Sons defenders who attempted to halt the Wolf King's advance found themselves facing an enemy that seemed specifically designed to counter every advantage their psychic abilities normally provided. Corvidi sorcerers who tried to predict the attacker's movements discovered that their precognitive abilities provided only fragmentary and contradictory visions when focused on the space wolves, as if some fundamental aspect of the Fenrisian warriors resisted prophetic sight. Piri Battle brothers who unleashed torrents of psychic flame watched in frustration as their attacks dissipated harmlessly against protective wards that had been woven into their enemies' very flesh through ritual scarification. Ozek Ahriman coordinated the defense from a command post established within the ruins of the Corvidi pyramid, his enhanced awareness allowing him to perceive the battle's progression across multiple districts simultaneously while maintaining psychic contact with scattered Thousand Sons units throughout the city. The Chief Librarian's tactical displays showed the inexorable advance of Space Wolves' forces as they systematically eliminated defensive positions and pushed toward the city's central nexus points. Each fallen strongpoint represented not only military defeat, but also the loss of irreplaceable knowledge as ancient libraries and research facilities disappeared beneath explosions that burned with colors that had no names in human languages. The Adeptus Custodes contingent advanced through Tizca's eastern approaches with the measured pace of beings who had never known defeat, their golden armor unmarked by the psychic energies that swirled around them like visible manifestations of frustrated sorcery. These warriors possessed training and equipment that had been developed specifically for combating supernatural threats, their guardian spears incorporating technology that could disrupt warp phenomena at the molecular level. Captain General Constantin Valdor led the formation personally, his ancient weapon leaving trails of golden fire as it carved through defensive barriers that had been reinforced with crystallized psychic energy. The Sisters of Silence moved through the battlefield like living voids, their presence creating zones where psychic phenomena simply ceased to function and the normal laws of physics reasserted their dominance over reality. Thousand Sons sorcerers who encountered these warrior women found their abilities completely neutralized, reducing them from superhuman warriors capable of reshaping reality through will alone to merely enhanced humans facing opponents who had trained for millennia in the arts of war. The psychological impact of this sudden powerlessness proved as devastating as the physical threat, as warriors who had defined themselves through their psychic gifts struggled to adapt to conventional combat methods. The Great Library of Tizca became the focal point for one of the most desperate defensive actions, as Ahriman personally led the effort to protect the accumulated knowledge of millennia from the systematic destruction that the attackers were visiting upon Prospero's repositories of learning. The Chief Librarian had assembled a mixed force of Thousand Sons veterans and Spireguard auxiliaries within the library's crystal-reinforced chambers, using the building's natural psychic amplification properties to enhance their defensive capabilities, while simultaneously working to evacuate the most critical texts and artifacts to secure locations deeper within the city. The Space Wolves' assault on the Great Library began with precision bombardment from orbital platforms, their specialized munitions designed to collapse crystalline structures without triggering the catastrophic psychic feedback that might result from the sudden release of accumulated warp energy. The bombardment created controlled demolitions that sealed many of the building's entrances while leaving the central chambers intact, forcing the attackers to advance through narrow corridors where the defenders' psychic abilities would provide maximum advantage despite the presence of nullification fields projected by accompanying Sisters of Silence. Ahriman's defense of the library showcased the tactical flexibility that had made him one of the most respected commanders within the Thousand Suns Legion, as he adapted his sorcerer's abilities to the confined environment and the specialized nature of their opponents. Raptora Battle Brothers used their telekinetic powers to manipulate the library's damaged architecture, creating barriers and obstacles that channeled the attackers into killing zones where Piri specialists could bring concentrated fire to bear. Pavoni sorcerers worked to heal wounded defenders and enhance their physical capabilities beyond normal Space Marine limits, while Corvidi seers provided early warning of assault teams attempting to breach the building's perimeter. The Space Wolves who penetrated the library's outer defenses found themselves fighting in an environment where every surface could potentially serve as a weapon in the hands of enemies who could manipulate matter through focused will. Ancient bookshelves became projectiles that flew through the air with deadly precision, while crystalline reading tables transformed into razor-sharp barriers that could slice through ceramite armor. The attackers adapted to these conditions through the brutal pragmatism that characterized their legion's approach to warfare, using demolition charges and heavy flamers to clear obstacles rather than attempting to counter the defenders' psychic manipulations directly. The battle for the library's central archive chamber lasted for hours, as both sides recognized the symbolic importance of the location and committed their most elite forces to either defending or capturing it. Ahriman fought alongside his battle brothers with a desperation born of understanding that defeat here would mean the loss of knowledge that could never be recovered, texts that contained the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that had vanished millennia before humanity's rise to galactic prominence. The chief librarian's psychic abilities had grown substantially since Magnus's pact with Tzinch, allowing him to manifest phenomena that bordered on the miraculous as he sought to protect his legion's most precious treasures. The Sisters of Silence contingent assigned to the library assault moved through the building's corridors like a plague of silence, their presence causing the psychic resonance that normally filled the structure to fade into oppressive quiet. Thousand Suns sorcerers who had spent their entire lives surrounded by the constant whisper of warp energies found the sudden absence of these familiar sensations more disturbing than any physical threat, as their enhanced senses struggled to adapt to an environment that felt fundamentally wrong on levels that transcended normal perception. The psychological impact of this sensory deprivation often proved more effective than conventional weapons in neutralizing defenders who had built their entire identity around their psychic gifts. The systematic destruction of Prospero's knowledge repositories continued throughout the battle, as Space Wolves' demolition teams employed specialized incendiary devices that ensured complete destruction of any materials that might contain dangerous information. Ancient texts that had survived the collapse of human civilization during the Age of Strife disappeared in flames that burned with unnatural colors, their destruction creating psychic echoes that reverberated through the warp and attracted the attention of entities that fed upon the death of knowledge. The loss of these irreplaceable works represented a cultural catastrophe that exceeded even the immediate military significance of the assault, as understanding that might have advanced human civilization by millennia vanished in moments. The Athenian Fellowship attempted to coordinate resistance through telepathic networks that linked scattered defenders across the city, but their communications were increasingly disrupted by the psychic interference generated by the Sisters of Silence and the reality distortions created by damaged crystal formations. The telepathic links that had once allowed near instantaneous coordination between widely separated units began failing as the psychic environment became too chaotic to support reliable mental contact. Individual Thousand Suns companies found themselves isolated and fighting desperate holding actions without clear understanding of the overall tactical situation or the fate of their brother units. Magnus remained sequestered in his tower sanctuary as the battle raged throughout his capital city, his consciousness trapped in cycles of guilt and self-recrimination that prevented him from taking decisive action to defend his world or his sons. The Crimson King's fragmented psyche detected the approaching threat through methods that transcended conventional awareness, but his shattered mental state made coherent thought increasingly difficult as demonic whispers exploited his psychological vulnerabilities. The voices that had once offered knowledge and power now spoke of revenge and the necessity of embracing the gifts that Tzeentch continued to offer, but Magnus's remaining loyalty to the Emperor made him resistant to their blandishments even as his world burned around him. The Space Wolves assault teams that pushed toward Magnus's tower encountered the most fanatical resistance from Thousand Suns warriors who viewed their Primarch's sanctuary as the ultimate symbol of their legion's identity and purpose. These defenders fought with a desperation that transcended normal tactical considerations, using psychic abilities that bordered on the suicidal as they channeled energies that threatened to tear their enhanced physiology apart from within. Scarab occult terminators deployed their most powerful sorcerous techniques without regard for the long-term consequences, manifesting phenomena that warped reality around them while simultaneously burning out their own nervous systems through psychic overload. The Legio Mortis Titan Legion had established firing positions in Tizca's outer districts, their massive war engines providing heavy fire support that could reduce even the strongest crystalline structures to rubble with single volleys from their primary weapons. The Titans' void shields flickered constantly as they absorbed the impact of psychic attacks that manifested as visible distortions in the air around their towering forms, while their crews worked frantically to maintain machine spirit communion despite the psychic interference that filled the battlefield. The God Machine's presence served both practical and psychological purposes, their overwhelming firepower breaking defensive positions, while their imposing silhouettes reminded all observers of the Imperium's ultimate authority. The battle's progression revealed the systematic nature of the Space Wolves' assault as they eliminated key infrastructure targets that supported Prospero's psychic enhancement networks. Communication arrays that had allowed coordination between distant cities fell silent as their crystalline components were reduced to slag by precision orbital strikes, while power generation facilities that had channeled geothermal energy through psychically conductive crystals exploded in chain reactions that sent pillars of multicolored flame hundreds of meters into the atmosphere. Each destroyed installation weakened the planetary defense network and reduced the effectiveness of the remaining Thousand Suns forces. The Spireguard regiments that served as Prospero's mortal military forces found themselves overwhelmed by opponents whose training and equipment had been specifically designed for combating enemies who employed psychic abilities. The enhanced weapons that the Spireguard normally used to devastating effect proved ineffective against Space Marines, whose armor incorporated protective wards, and whose tactical doctrine emphasized rapid assault that prevented the defenders from establishing effective firing positions. The mortal soldiers' psychic abilities, which had once made them formidable opponents despite their human limitations, became liabilities when faced with Sisters of Silence, whose very presence negated supernatural phenomena. The collapse of organized resistance in Tizca's outer districts forced the surviving Thousand Suns defenders to fall back toward the city's central nexus, where the concentration of psychic amplification devices might provide some advantage against their specialized opponents. This withdrawal allowed the attackers to consolidate their positions and bring additional heavy weapons to bear against the remaining strongpoints, while also enabling the systematic destruction of facilities that had served as repositories for dangerous knowledge. The retreat marked the beginning of the end for Prospero's defense, as the compressed perimeter made coordination increasingly difficult while providing the attackers with clearly defined objectives. The final phase of the battle for Tizca began as Space Wolves' forces converged on the city's central districts from multiple directions, their coordinated advance designed to prevent any possibility of organized breakout attempts or the evacuation of key personnel to other locations. The Wolf King's tactical doctrine emphasized the complete elimination of all resistance rather than the capture of strategic objectives, reflecting his interpretation of the mission's requirements and his understanding of the threat that corrupted psykers represented to Imperial security. The systematic nature of the assault left no room for mercy or negotiation, as Russ viewed the entire population of Prospero as potentially compromised by their exposure to forbidden knowledge. The convergence of Space Wolves' forces around Magnus's Tower Sanctuary marked the climax of Prospero's destruction, as the Wolf King's assault columns finally breached the inner defensive perimeter that had protected the Crimson King's personal domain. The tower itself rose from Tizca's central district like a crystalline mountain, its faceted surfaces reflecting the fires that consumed the surrounding city while pulsing with internal energies that spoke of the vast psychic power contained within its geometrically perfect structure. Leman Russ approached this final objective with grim determination, his frost-encrusted armor bearing the scars of hours of brutal combat as he led his warriors through streets littered with the debris of shattered crystal formations and the bodies of fallen defenders. The Adeptus Custodes had established a cordon around the tower's base, their golden armor unmarked despite the psychic storms that raged around Magnus's sanctuary. These warriors maintained perfect formation despite the reality distortions that caused the ground beneath their feet to ripple like liquid and made the air shimmer with colors that had no names in human languages. Captain General Constantin Valdor coordinated the final assault preparations with methodical precision, his ancient experience in combating supernatural threats evident in every tactical decision, as he positioned his forces to prevent any possibility of escape while simultaneously preparing for the psychic phenomena that would inevitably accompany a confrontation with one of the Emperor's sons. Magnus finally emerged from his self-imposed isolation as the attackers breached his tower's outer defenses, his massive form materializing at the structure's apex through methods that transcended normal physical movement. The Crimson King's appearance had changed dramatically since his catastrophic attempt to warn the Emperor, his flesh bearing mutations that reflected the fragmentation of his psyche and his growing connection to the chaos god Tzeentch. Additional eyes had opened across his crimson skin, each organ capable of perceiving different aspects of reality, while his remaining primary eye blazed with energies that caused the air around him to ignite spontaneously. The confrontation between the two Primarchs began not with words, but with a psychic assault that sent shockwaves through both the material universe and the warp, as Magnus attempted to demonstrate the futility of opposing someone who had transcended normal physical limitations. The Crimson King's attack manifested as waves of pure mental force that should have reduced normal humans to catatonic vegetables, but Russ weathered the assault through a combination of natural resistance and protective wards that had been woven into his very essence by Fenris's rune priests. The Wolf King's defiance in the face of overwhelming psychic power served as inspiration for his warriors, while simultaneously enraging Magnus beyond rational thought. Leman Russ responded to his brother's psychic assault with the brutal directness that characterized all of his actions, launching himself toward Magnus's position with a leap that covered impossible distances through application of enhanced physiology and sheer determination. The Wolf King's frost axe, Mjalnar, blazed with runic power as it carved through the psychic barriers that surrounded Magnus, its ancient blade incorporating materials and enchantments that had been specifically designed for combating entities that existed partially within the warp. The weapon's impact against Magnus's hastily erected defenses created explosions of crystallized energy that rained down upon the battlefield like deadly hail. Magnus retaliated with sorcerous techniques that warped reality around the combatants, transforming the tower's crystalline structure into a battlefield where the normal laws of physics operated according to his will rather than natural principles. Gravity shifted and twisted as the Crimson King manipulated fundamental forces, while time itself seemed to flow differently in various areas of the combat zone. Russ adapted to these impossible conditions through instinctive understanding rather than intellectual analysis, his warrior's intuition allowing him to anticipate changes in the environment while maintaining relentless pressure against his psychically enhanced opponent. The battle between the Primarchs represented more than simple fraternal conflict, embodying the fundamental philosophical divisions that had emerged within the Imperium regarding humanity's relationship with psychic power and the proper limits of knowledge. Magnus fought with the desperate fury of someone defending not only his own life, but also his life's work and the accumulated wisdom of millennia, while Russ attacked with the righteous conviction of a warrior, eliminating a threat to everything he held sacred. Their combat served as a microcosm of the larger civil war that was beginning to tear the galaxy apart, as brother fought brother over irreconcilable differences in vision and purpose. The space wolves who witnessed their Primarch's battle with Magnus found themselves struggling to comprehend the scale of forces being unleashed around them, as reality itself became a weapon in the hands of combatants whose power transcended normal understanding. Veteran warriors who had fought across the galaxy during the Great Crusade watched in awe as their Gene Father matched blow for blow with an opponent who could reshape matter through focused will, his mundane weapons somehow finding purchase against defenses that should have been impervious to physical attack. The sight of Russ holding his own against such overwhelming supernatural power reinforced their faith in the righteousness of their cause, while demonstrating the futility of relying on sorcery rather than honest steel. Magnus's fragmented psyche began manifesting as multiple aspects of his personality took physical form around the battlefield, each fragment representing different elements of his character and wielding distinct portions of his overall power. These psychic projections fought with techniques that reflected their individual natures, some employing scholarly precision, while others unleashed raw destructive force that carved through the tower's crystalline structure like acid through flesh. The multiplication of opponents forced Russ to divide his attention between multiple threats while simultaneously maintaining his assault against the primary manifestation of his brother's consciousness. The Crimson King's acceptance of Tzeentch's full embrace occurred during the battle's climax, as Magnus finally abandoned his remaining loyalty to the Emperor and embraced the power that the Chaos God had been offering since their initial bargain. The transformation was visible as a wave of mutation that rippled across Magnus's form, his flesh flowing like liquid as it adapted to accommodate energies that no mortal frame could contain without fundamental alteration. Wings of psychic force erupted from his shoulders, while his skin took on the consistency of living flame, creating a being that existed as much within the warp as in the material universe. This final corruption provided Magnus with power that exceeded anything he had previously wielded, but it also completed his damnation and severed the last connections that bound him to his original purpose as one of the Emperor's sons. The Crimson King's enhanced abilities allowed him to gain temporary advantage over Russ, his attacks now carrying the full weight of chaos behind them as reality bent to accommodate forces that originated from outside the natural order. However, the transformation also made him vulnerable to the specialized weapons and techniques that the attacking forces had brought specifically for combating demonic entities. The Sisters of Silence contingent surrounding the tower began projecting their nullification fields at maximum intensity as they detected the massive psychic disturbance created by Magnus's transformation, their combined efforts creating a zone of psychic dead space that extended throughout the immediate area. The sudden absence of warp energies struck Magnus like a physical blow, as abilities that had become integral to his existence suddenly ceased to function properly. The Crimson King found himself struggling to maintain coherent form as the psychic forces that held his mutated flesh together were disrupted by the Blank's presence. Leman Russ pressed his advantage with the relentless determination that had made him one of the Imperium's most feared warriors, his frost axe carving through Magnus's weakened defenses to inflict wounds that burned with runic fire and refused to heal through normal regeneration. Each successful strike sent fragments of the Crimson King's essence screaming back into the warp, reducing his physical presence while simultaneously weakening his connection to the material universe. The Wolf King's assault represented not merely physical violence, but also a form of exorcism that sought to banish the demonic influences that had corrupted his brother beyond redemption. The final blow came as Russ's axe found its mark across Magnus's spine. The runic weapon's enchantments interacting with the Crimson King's transformed physiology to create a cascade failure that shattered his physical form like glass struck by a hammer. Magnus's body exploded into fragments of crystallized psychic energy that scattered across the battlefield, while his consciousness was torn apart by forces that exceeded even his enhanced ability to comprehend. The surviving Thousand Sons throughout Tizca felt their Primarch's death as a psychic shockwave that left many of them temporarily catatonic, their enhanced senses overwhelmed by the sudden absence of the consciousness that had served as their spiritual anchor for over a century. Those who retained their faculties recognized that their cause was lost and began implementing evacuation protocols that had been prepared for exactly such catastrophic scenarios. Ozek Ahriman led the organized withdrawal from Prospero's surface, using his mastery of teleportation techniques to transport survivors to concealed ships that had been hidden in the system's outer reaches. The evacuation to the planet of the sorcerers occurred through emergency protocols that Magnus had established years earlier as contingency plans for potential imperial sanctions against his legion. The survivors who escaped Prospero's destruction found themselves transported to a world within the Eye of Terror, where the normal laws of physics held no sway and reality could be shaped through focused will. This demon world had been claimed by Tzeentch as a reward for Magnus's service, though the Chaos God's gifts always carried prices that exceeded their apparent value. The planet of the sorcerers became the new home for the remnants of the Thousand Sons Legion, though the world's chaotic nature meant that their exile would be filled with constant struggle against the very environment they inhabited. The planet's surface shifted constantly as competing psychic influences reshaped geography according to their desires, while the sky burned with colors that existed only within the warp. The survivors found themselves changed by prolonged exposure to such concentrated chaos energy, their mutations accelerating as their enhanced physiology adapted to conditions that would have killed normal humans within moments. Magnus's consciousness eventually reformed within the warp as a demon prince of Tzeentch, though the being that emerged bore only superficial resemblance to the Primarch, who had once served as one of the Emperor's most trusted sons. The fragmentation of his psyche during the battle with Russ had created permanent divisions within his personality that would never fully heal, leaving him as a creature of contradictions who possessed vast power but lacked the focused will necessary to employ it effectively. His transformation into a demon prince represented both reward and punishment, as he gained immortality and supernatural abilities while losing much of what had made him recognizably human. The aftermath of Prospero's destruction reverberated throughout the galaxy as news of the sanction reached other Space Marine legions and Imperial institutions. The complete annihilation of one of the Emperor's sons and the near-total destruction of his legion sent shockwaves through the Astartes Brotherhood, demonstrating that even Primarchs were not immune to the consequences of defying Imperial authority. The systematic destruction of Prospero's libraries represented a cultural catastrophe that would handicap human understanding of psychic phenomena for millennia to come, as irreplaceable knowledge vanished in flames that burned with unnatural colors. The Space Wolves departed Prospero's smoking ruins with grim satisfaction at having completed their assigned mission, though many warriors struggled with the psychological impact of having participated in the destruction of their own brothers. Leman Russ himself bore the weight of fratricide heavily, understanding that his actions had been necessary, but finding no joy in the victory that had cost him a brother, and eliminated an entire legion from the Emperor's service. The Wolf King's interpretation of his orders as requiring Magnus's death rather than capture would later prove to have been manipulated by Horus, though this knowledge would come too late to change the consequences of his actions. The eternal enmity between the Space Wolves and the surviving Thousand Sons was cemented by the events on Prospero, creating a hatred that would persist across millennia and influence countless future conflicts. The survivors who had escaped to the planet of the sorcerers nursed their grievances against the Sons of Fenris, while planning revenge that would eventually manifest during the great conflicts of the 41st millennium. The destruction of Prospero marked the beginning of a cycle of vengeance that would claim thousands of lives on both sides, while serving the interests of the chaos gods who fed upon such conflicts. The Thousand Sons' fall to chaos was completed not through the dramatic corruption that had claimed other traitor legions, but through the gradual erosion of their loyalty caused by betrayal and abandonment by the Imperium they had served faithfully for over a century. Their exile to the Eye of Terror placed them beyond redemption in the eyes of Imperial authorities, while simultaneously exposing them to corrupting influences that would slowly transform them into the very monsters that their enemies had claimed they already were. The irony of this transformation would not be lost on those survivors who retained sufficient awareness to understand what they had become. The Burning of Prospero thus concluded with the complete victory of Imperial forces and the apparent elimination of the Thousand Sons' threat, though the true consequences of these events would not become apparent for years to come. The destruction of Magnus and his legion represented both a tactical success for the Loyalist cause and a strategic victory for the forces of chaos, as it removed potential opposition to Horus's rebellion while simultaneously driving powerful psychers into the embrace of the ruinous powers. The flames that consumed Tizca's crystal spires would burn in the memories of survivors for millennia, serving as both warning and inspiration for future generations who would face similar choices between loyalty and survival in a galaxy where both virtues often proved incompatible with continued existence.